Critical Thinking. Improve Your Academic Standards and Objectivity by Marco Jameson. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1. Our Concept of Critical Thinking. There are many ways to articulate the idea of critical thinking, yet each substantive conception must include certain core elements. Consider these short concepts of critical thinking. Getting started with critical thinking. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceiving, applying, evaluating, manufacturing, and/or examining info gathered from or produced by experience, observation, reflection, reason, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In its excellent form, it is based on universal intellectual values that go beyond subject divisions: clearness, accuracy, precision, consistency, importance, soundproof, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. Critical thinking is self-guided, self-disciplined thinking, which attempts to think at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way. Most people who think critically with constant and mindful effort live reasonably, fairly, and emphatically. They are keenly aware of the inherently problematic nature of human thinking when left unattended. They strive to lessen the power of their egocentric and sociocentric tendencies. They make use of the intellectual tools that critical thinking offers us, principles that enable them to evaluate and improve thinking. They work vigilantly to develop the intellectual virtues of intellectual stability, intellectual humility, intellectual civility, intellectual empathy, intellectual sense of justice, and self-confidence in reason. They recognize that no matter how skilled they are as thinkers, they can always enhance their thinking capabilities, and they will at times fall prey to errors in reasoning, human irrationality, bias, predispositions, distortions, uncritically accepted social rules and taboos, self-interest, and beneficial interest. They strive to improve the world in whatever ways they can and contribute to a more reasonable, civilized society. At the same time, they recognize the complexities usually inherent in doing so. They make every effort never to think simplistically about complicated issues and always to consider the rights and needs of pertinent others. They recognize the complexities in developing as thinkers and commit themselves to lifelong practice towards self-improvement. They embody the Socratic concept: the unexamined life is not actually worth living, as they recognize that many unexamined lives together lead to an uncritical, unfair, harmful world. Why critical thinking? The issue. Everybody thinks. It is our nature to do so. However, much of our thinking left to itself is prejudiced, distorted, partial, uninformed, or downright prejudiced. Yet the quality of our lives and that of what we produce, make, or build depends exactly on the quality of our thought. Shoddy thinking is expensive, both in money and in quality of life. Excellence in thought, though, should be systematically cultivated. A brief definition. Critical thinking is the art of evaluating thinking with a view to improving it. The result. A well-cultivated critical thinker raises crucial questions and problems, developing them obviously and specifically. Gathers and evaluates pertinent information using abstract ideas to interpret it effectively. Comes to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions, testing them against relevant criteria and requirements. Thinks open-mindedly within alternative systems of idea, recognizing and assessing as need be their assumptions, ramifications, and practical consequences, and communicates successfully with others in determining options to complicated issues. Critical thinking is, in short, self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective thinking. It needs extensive standards of quality and mindful command of their use. It requires efficient communication and problem-solving abilities, and a commitment to conquering our native egocentrism and sociocentrism. Our conception of critical thinking is based on the substantive approach developed by Dr. Richard Paul and his colleagues at the Center and Structure for Critical Studying several decades. It is relevant to each topic, discipline, and profession, and to thinking through the problems of everyday life. It entails 5 necessary dimensions of critical thinking: the analysis of thoughts, the evaluation of thoughts, the dispositions of thoughts, the abilities of thought, the barriers to critical thought. At the left is an introduction of the first 3 dimensions. In sum, the elements or structures of thought enable us to take our thinking apart and analyze it. The intellectual standards are used to assess and examine the elements. The intellectual traits are dispositions of mind embodied by the fair-minded critical thinker. To cultivate the mind, we need command of these vital measurements, and we need to regularly use them as we think through the many issues in our lives. Chapter 2: The Components of Thinking and Academic Standards. If you want to think well, you should comprehend at least the aspects of thought, the most fundamental structures out of which all thinking is made. You should learn how to take thinking apart. Analyzing the logic of a subject. When we comprehend the aspects of reasoning, we realize that all subjects, all disciplines, have a fundamental reasoning described by the structures of thought ingrained within them. Because of this, to lay bare a subject's most basic logic, we should begin with these questions. What is the primary incentive or objective of studying this subject? What are those who are in this field attempting to achieve? What sorts of questions do they ask? What kinds of problems do they try to resolve? What sorts of info or data do they gather? What kinds of inferences do they usually draw? What types of judgment do they normally make? How do they tackle gathering info in ways that are distinct to this field? What are the most basic ideas or theories in this field? What do experts in this field take for granted or presume? How should studying this field impact my view of the world? What viewpoint is fostered in this field? What implications follow from studying this discipline? How are the items of this field used in daily life? How might they be used in ways that aren't currently? Going much deeper. While most critical thinking principles are instinctual, to integrate and use these principles consistently and logically takes concerted effort, research study, and reflection. Just like professional athletes or musical artists must practice to master their sport or art, so too should thinkers practice to master their minds. Chapter 3: Useful Ways to Improve Critical Thinking. Critical thinking is as simple as it sounds. It's just a way of thinking that helps you get a little closer to the best answer to it. And therefore, the next time you have a problem to resolve, a decision to make, or a claim to evaluate, you can decide whether it is likely to be true. and if you should do anything about it. Number 1. Do not take anything at stated value. The first step to thinking critically is to learn to examine what you hear, what you read, and what you choose to do. So, instead of doing something because it's what you've always done or accepting what you've heard as the truth, spend a little time just thinking. What's the problem? What are the possible solutions? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? Of course, you still need to choose what to believe and what to do. But if you actually examine things, you're likely to make a much better, more reasoned choice. Number 2. Consider motive. We recently got a call from our cellular company about changing our very old, very low-cost mobile phone plan. They said they could give us a new plan that would offer better value. However, why, my partner asked, would the company be intrigued in pursuing us so that we could pay less? Aren't firms typically fascinated by making more cash? Good question, right? And the main reason why we were asking it is because we questioned the cellular phone company's intentions. What they said just didn't make a lot of sense. Where information is coming from is an essential part of thinking seriously about it. Everyone has a motive and a bias. At times, like the mobile phone company, it is pretty clear. Other times, it is a lot harder to discover. Just know that where any information comes from should influence how you assess it and whether you decide to act on it. Number 3. Do your research. All the information that gets thrown at us every day can be frustrating. But if you decide to take matters into your own hands, it can also be a very effective tool. If you have a problem to solve, a choice to make, or a perspective to examine, get onto Google and start checking it out. The more info you have, the better prepared you're going to be to think about it and think of a sensible answer to your query. Number 4. Ask questions. I sometimes find myself shying away from questions. They can make me feel a little bit of a dummy, specifically when whoever's fielding them is not receptive. Though, mostly, I can't help myself. I just really need to know. And once you go down that rabbit hole, you not only discover more, but usually discover whole new ways of thinking of things. I think those other perspectives can also help you get closer to analyzing an issue or revealing what's what, which brings me to my next point. Number 5. Don't assume that you're right. I know it is tough. I have to cope with the hard-headed desire to be right as much as the next person, because being right feels awesome. It's an ego trip practically everyone aims to take at some time or another. However, presuming you're right will usually put you on the wrong track when it comes to thinking seriously. As if you don't take in other viewpoints and points of view and think them over and compare them to your own, you really aren't doing much thinking at all, and definitely not the critical kind. Number 6. Break it down. Being able to see the big picture is usually promoted as a great quality, but I'd wager that having the ability to see that image for all its parts is even better. After all, most issues are too big to resolve all at once, but they can be broken down into smaller parts. The littler the part, the much easier it'll be to examine them separately and come to a resolution. This is basically what scientists do. Before they can figure out how a bigger system, such as our bodies or a community, works, they have to understand all of the parts of that system, how they work, and how they relate to one another. Number 7. Keep it simple. In the clinical community, a line of reasoning called Occam's razor is usually used to choose which hypothesis is more than likely to be true. That means finding the easiest clarification that fits all facts. This is what you would call the most clear clarification and the one that should be preferred, at least until it's proven wrong. Typically, Occam's razor is just plain sound judgment. Fine, it's possible that the costly skin cream on TV will make you look 20 years younger, although you have never ever heard about it, and neither has anybody else. What's more likely is that that model shown in the advertisement really is 20 years old. Critical thinking is not simple. It involves letting go of what we wish to believe and embracing an entire bunch of new information. It's awkward, but it's also fascinating. And when you do your research and finally set out what you actually believe to be the facts, you will most likely be surprised by what you uncover. It might not be what you were expecting, but chances are it'll be closer to the truth. Chapter 4: The Wrong Way to Enhance Critical Thinking. What I really believe is the wrong way to enhance critical thinking is sadly the kind frequently taught in schools. This approach starts by teaching you some basic guidelines of sensible deduction, modus ponens, a few examples of fallacies, and an entire lot of Latin terms that thinkers use. You overcome several problem sets, and voila, you are supposed to be able to reason seriously about real-world problems. While there is nothing wrong with studying reasoning and rationality per se, I do not think these methods provide on their desired promise. One particular example is there is few facts about how our brain actually reasons that make this route to improved rationality a dubious one. Problem number 1. Critical thinking isn't a faculty. The first problem was actually resolved over a century ago by psychologists Edward Thorndike and Robert Woodworth. The well-known view of learning of their day was the idea that human brains included large, distinct faculties like reasoning, memory, and judgment, and that by practicing them on subjects, regardless of their relevance to the real world, would reinforce these faculties, just like raising weights in the gym improves your muscles. The problem is that this notion of the mind does not work. The brain is not like a muscle. Rather than general, abstract professors that can be enhanced with non-specific training, improvements to the mind have the tendency to be incredibly specific. General improvements, when they happen, tend to result out of the buildup of many, many particular enhancements, rather than unassociated and generalized ones. Think about learning another language. The faculty view says that learning Latin will improve your linguistic faculties. While there's some benefit of this, the majority of the work of learning a language is learning particular vocabulary. Hence, if you want to learn Japanese, you are best off learning Japanese vocabulary. Mastering Latin first won't help too much. Similarly, critical thinking is not just a single monolithic capability that reduces to abstract sensible forms. Instead, it's numerous facts, reasonings, heuristics, and context-specific capabilities that should be developed through abundant exposure to real circumstances. Problem number 2. Thinking is largely rationalization. The argumentative theory of reason, which I covered in depth here, suggests that the seeming failure of many types of human reason are misinterpreted as they do not recognize reason's true function. Rather than a general purpose way of making better decisions, reason is a faculty for producing explanations and assessing those of others. The intelligence comes from throughout the brain, through mainly instinctive modules, which are pretty specific and trained through practice, rather than some mystical professors that does critical thinking. If this principle is correct, then another reason critical thinking is tough to improve is that we're mainly not coming up with more intelligent decisions when we think critically, but trying to produce more attractive arguments for our positions, or more incisive attacks on the arguments of others. While this kind of critical reasoning via debate has real advantages for our collective knowledge, individually, it does not help quite so much. Rather, critical thinking, when used alone, tends to be more of a tool for justifying your intuitions instead of methodically examining them to make better choices. The proper way to improve critical thinking. So, if the traditional view of critical thinking is wrong, what's the proper way of doing it? I think there's two broad approaches that will work to make better choices. The first is creating a context that will cause better choices in light of what we know about human thinking already. The second is to absorb lots and tons of knowledge about the world and incorporate it through practice making decisions. To put it simply, critical thinking comes from being wise. Method number 1: creating contexts that make it possible for smart choices. This initial method is to recognize what you are actually doing when you're reasoning about things and uses this knowledge to try to keep away from making typical mistakes. Given what we know about how reason works, there's a few things you can do. Number 1, take a look at the choice in several times, spots, and moods. Since reason tends to be more to justify than to create the right judgment, one way to avoid making mistakes is to reason about the exact same issue in a lot of different contexts. The modular concept of mind says that rather than a single coordinated function, the brain includes a lot of semi-autonomous modules that all vote their favored action into the brain. Depending upon which module is more highly triggered by the framework around you, its vote will get higher weight. So if you're hungry, scared, angry, sleepy, joyful, or sad, you may get different inputs into which decision is right. For this reason, reasoning about a decision in several moods, places, and settings will give you the greatest variety of backgrounds to reason about things. If the decision is the exact same each time, you can be more confident that you have the right evaluation. Number 2, speak to more people and have more arguments. The argumentative concept of reason suggests that reason doesn't work well alone. Nevertheless, it does work remarkably when combined in public debate. Many well-known problems of human thinking disappear once you get a group of people together and let them speak about it. Discussing your decision or judgment with others is a great way to see your ideas refuted or let more powerful ideas win the day. Even though there's a risk of groupthink and conformity pressures, if you take a large and varied enough group, you are more likely to be exposed to the best reasoning, which will tend to win out over the majority viewpoint. Number 3, do not stake your credibility on your choice. One of the biggest challenges to conquer in critical thinking is that you could not appropriately upgrade your beliefs in the face of new evidence. Old beliefs might stick stubbornly to their prior position, even once you are revealed to be wrong. Part of this might be because, in an argumentative concept of reason, we are attempting to justify our instinctive beliefs instead of refute them. Thus, if you're only searching for why you're right, you naturally neglect why you're wrong. Even so, another big part might be the social repercussions of flip-flopping on your position. If your credibility and identity is staked on an idea being right, you almost certainly will not update adequately when you're exposed with reasons that undermine your views. I have tried to counter this tendency in myself by discussing when I'm wrong. By sharing these inversions of beliefs, I am hoping to separate myself from the content of my ideas so I can discard the ones that don't work, rather than cling to them for fear of looking absurd. Strategy number 2, be smarter and know more. The second technique to improving critical thinking, which actually works, is to simply find out more about the world. The more you know about things, the better you can reason about them. I recently had an experience of this when someone told me that they were stressed the Wi-Fi signals from their phone may trigger cancer. I clarified that this doesn't make any sense. Wi-Fi signals are microwave radiation and extremely low power. Cancer is triggered when DNA is damaged. For that to happen, radiation needs to be energetic enough to break molecular bonds. Ultraviolet radiation is strong enough to do this, which is why we should put on sunblock. But noticeable light is not, which is exactly why you do not really need sunblock indoors. Microwave radiation is an even lower frequency than that, so it can't cause cancer. The issue was not that this person didn't have good critical thinking abilities. It's not irrational to presume a new technology might have unstudied effects, including causing cancer. If you heard this from a good friend who you think is pretty clever about other things, that is not a terrible way to make a decision about the risk. The issue instead was that this person didn't know enough about electromagnetism to see why this claim didn't make any sense. If they did, they should be far more anxious about all of the light bulbs outputting higher frequency visible light at higher power every day than the faint beam of microwaves put out by the phone. Critical thinking, for this reason, does not happen because you've studied some abstract sensible form and come to legitimate deductions. It happens since you actually know enough about how the world works to rule out certain possibilities as being unlikely or impossible. The drawback to this is that it means critical thinking can't just be gotten by taking a few credits in college. It means you really need to be learning continuously about all subjects so as to make intelligent choices. The benefit is that it also means much smarter decisions are possible. Far from just being an abstract faculty you either have or you do not, critical thinking is a part of the process of understanding things to begin with, and that you can get a lot better at it by discovering more throughout your life. Chapter 5. About objectivity. The terms objectivity and subjectivity, in their modern-day usage, normally relate to a viewing topic, typically an individual, and a viewed or unperceived item. The item is a thing which probably exists independent of the subject's perception of it. To put it simply, the item would be there, as it is, even if no subject perceived it. Thus, objectivity is typically connected with ideas such as reality, truth, and dependability. The viewing subject can either view properly or seem to view features of the object that aren't in the item. An example could be this. A perceiving subject suffering from jaundice could appear to view a thing as yellow when the item isn't actually yellow. For that reason, the term subjective normally shows the possibility of error. The potential for inconsistencies between features of the topic's perceptual impressions and the real qualities of the perceived thing creates philosophical questions. There are also philosophical questions regarding the nature of objective reality and the nature of our so-called subjective reality. Subsequently, we have various determined of the terms unbiased and subjective, and their cognates to express possible differences between objective reality and subjective impressions. Theorists describe affective impressions themselves as being subjective or objective. Consequent judgments are objective or subjective to differing degrees, and we divide reality into objective reality and subjective reality. Thus, it is important to differentiate the numerous determined of the terms unbiased and subjective. Number 1. Terms. Many thinkers would use the term unbiased reality to describe anything that exists as it is independent of any conscious awareness of it, via perception, thought, etc. Common mid-sized physical objects most likely apply, as do individuals having subjective states. Subjective reality would then include anything relying on some broadly interpreted conscious awareness of it to exist. Specific circumstances of colors and sounds, as they are perceived, are prime examples of things that exist only when there are appropriate mindful states. Particular instances of feelings, i.e., my present happiness, also appears to be a subjective reality existing when one feels them and disappearing when one's mood changes. Objective knowledge can just describe knowledge of an unbiased reality. Subjective knowledge would then be knowledge of any subjective reality. There are, though, other determined terms associated with neutrality. A lot of thinkers use the term subjective knowledge to refer only to knowledge of one's own subjective states. Such knowledge is distinguished from one's knowledge of another individual's subjective states, and from knowledge of objective reality, which would both be unbiased knowledge under the present descriptions. Your knowledge of another person's subjective states can be called objective knowledge, since it is presumably part of the world that is item for you, just as you and your subjective states are part of the world that's object for the other person. This is a popular distinction in epistemology, the philosophical study of basic knowledge, because many philosophers have preserved that subjective knowledge in this sense has a special status. They assert, approximately, that knowledge of somebody's own subjective states is direct, or instant, in a way that knowledge of anything else is not. It is practical to describe knowledge of one's own subjective states simply as subjective knowledge. Following this definition, objective knowledge would be knowledge of anything besides one's own subjective states. One last prominent style of usage for terms associated with objectivity handle the nature of support a certain knowledge claim has. Objective knowledge can designate a knowledge claim having, approximately, the status of being fully supported or shown. Similarly, subjective knowledge may designate some unsupported or weakly supported knowledge claim. It is more precise to refer to these as objective and subjective judgments rather than knowledge. But one should be on guard for the usage of the term knowledge in this context. This usage fits with the general association for the term objectivity of strength, dependability, precision, impartiality, etc. The general association for many determined of subjectivity includes unreliability, bias, and incomplete personal perspective, and so on. Unbiased judgment or belief refers to a judgment or belief based upon objectively strong supporting evidence, the sort of evidence that would be engaging for any logical being. A subjective judgment would then seem a judgment or belief supported by evidence that is compelling for some rational beings, subjects, but not compelling for others. It could also refer to a judgment based upon evidence that is of requirement readily available solely to some subjects. These are the main determined for the terminology within philosophical discussions. Let's take a look at some of the main epistemological concerns regarding objectivity, presuming the aforementioned descriptions of objective reality and subjective reality. Chapter 6. Critical Thinking Skills for Job Interviews. Critical Thinking Skill. Active Listening. What's active listening, and why is it crucial for your career? Active listening is the process by which an individual secures info from another individual or group. The active aspect involves taking steps to draw out details that may not otherwise be shared. Active listeners avoid interrupting at all costs, summarize, and repeat back what they have heard, and observe body language to give them an additional level of understanding. Active listening is a practical ability for any worker to develop. It helps you really understand what people are saying in conversations and conferences, and not just what you want to hear or think you hear. At the time of interviews, it can help you build rapport with your job interviewer. What is active listening? Like critical thinking and problem solving, active listening is a soft skill that's held in high regard by employers. When talking to for jobs, using active listening techniques can help show the job interviewer how your social skills can draw people out. Active listening redirects your focus from what's going on inside of your head to the needs of your prospective company or interviewer. This technique can help reduce your nervousness during an interview. By placing your focus through active listening directly upon the recruiter, you prove that you are interested in the company's obstacles and successes, are ready to help them problem solve work problems, are a team player instead of being absolutely nothing more than a narcissistic job candidate. It is very important to not interrupt, or worse, try to answer the question before you know what the job interviewer is asking. Examples of active listening techniques. There are a lot of active listening techniques that will enhance the impression that you can make at a job interview. Active listening techniques include building trust and developing rapport, showing concern, paraphrasing to show understanding, nonverbal cues which show understanding, like nodding, eye contact, and leaning forward, short verbal affirmations like I see, I know, sure, thank you, or I understand, asking open-ended questions, asking specific questions to look for explanation, waiting to divulge your opinion, revealing comparable experiences to show understanding. Good examples of active listening responses. It's usually simpler to learn by reading examples. Here are several examples of statements and questions employed with active listening. Building trust and developing rapport. Tell me what I can do to help. I was really satisfied to continue reading your website how you contribute 5% of each sale to charity. Showing concern. I aspire to help. I know you're going through some rough obstacles. I know how hard a corporate reconstruction can be. How is staff spirits at this moment? Paraphrasing. So, you are saying that the uncertainty about who will be your new manager is creating stress for you. So, you believe that we really need to develop our social media marketing efforts? Brief verbal affirmation. I understand that you'd like more regular feedback about your efficiency. Many thanks. I appreciate your time in speaking to me. Asking open-ended questions. I see that John's criticism was very upsetting to you. Which element of his critique was most disturbing? It's clear that the current situation is intolerable for you. What changes would you like to see? Asking specific questions. Just how long do you expect your hiring process to last? What is your typical rate of staff turnover? Waiting to divulge your opinion. Tell me more about your proposal to reorganize the department. Can you please offer some history for me concerning your relationship with your former business partner? Disclosing comparable circumstances. I was also contrasted about going back to work after the birth of my son. I had the responsibility of terminating some of my workers as a result of scaling down, over the last 2 years. Regardless of whether it's needed, it never gets easier. More active listening abilities. Validation. Emotional intelligence. Problem sensitivity. Courtesy. Professionalism and reliability. Nonverbal communication. Transparency. Stability. Humbleness. Proactivity. Accepting positive critical remarks. Creating and managing expectations. Self-confidence. Empathy. Understanding. Observation. Attention to detail. Vocal tone. Sensitivity to spiritual and racial diversity. Self-awareness. Situational recognition. Interpretation. Identify and manage emotions. Understanding hidden needs of others. Body language. Facilitating seminar. Reaching consensus. Partnership. By employing these active listening strategies, you will impress your interviewer as a thoughtful, analytical, highly desirable prospect for the position. Think of possible situations that might happen during an interview and come up with methods to allow you to listen actively. Critical thinking skill. Emotional intelligence. Can managers and other staff members develop emotional intelligence, EI? While some scientists really believe that emotional intelligence is an innate particular, others actually believe that emotional intelligence can be learned and reinforced. The Can Be Learned and Increased Club is my choice, since I have experienced many individuals who have improved their emotional intelligence when they put their minds to it. Actually, in coaching and consulting with organizations, one area of focus has been to help leaders further develop their emotional intelligence. This is the most crucial dichotomy noted by Kendra Cherry in her description of emotional intelligence and its history. Managers and emotional intelligence. Have you ever known a supervisor who had poorly developed emotional intelligence? This supervisor has difficulty understanding the feelings that are communicated in each message by workers. With the amount of the meaning of the message that staff members communicate via nonverbal cues, facial expressions, and intonation, this manager has a serious drawback. He will have difficulty getting the whole message that the employee is trying to communicate. A supervisor with a low EI capability is also ineffective at understanding and expressing his own feelings. This includes recognizing the fact that he has underdeveloped EI. A typical reaction is to say that he is totally open up to feedback, but that the communicator is wrong about this problem. But the main issue with a supervisor with low EI is the supervisor's failure to recognize and understand the effect of her or his actions and declarations on colleagues in the office. A second major issue for a low EI supervisor is that a colleague or reporting employee who has highly developed emotional intelligence can play the low EI manager like a fine-tuned violin, for better and for even worse. Emotional intelligence at work. Can managers do anything about this? Emotional intelligence can be learned and enhanced, but only when a worker understands how emotional intelligence is observable and useful in the work environment. Cherry states that Peter Salovey and John D. Mayer, leading emotional intelligence researchers, recognize 4 elements of emotional intelligence: the perception of emotion, the ability to reason with emotions, the ability to comprehend emotion, and the capability to manage emotions. Situations of abilities that an individual with emotional intelligence may show in these elements include awareness of and ability to read body language and other nonverbal communication that includes facial expressions, the capability to listen so intently that they can hear the words not spoken by taking notice of the intonation, inflection, stops briefly, and other cues. The capability to control and deal with aggravation, anger, grief, joy, irritation, and other feelings. Acknowledging and reacting to the impact that his/her words and actions are having on colleagues, whether they notify the supervisor of the impact or not. Comprehending the underlying feeling of a communication from an employee and reacting as efficiently to the emotional elements of the communication as to the stated needs. Efficiently interpreting the cause of the emotion expressed by a coworker. That said, dejected posture can indicate a considerable problem in the house as well as an unresolved work problem. Increasing your emotional intelligence. Managers who have the ability to relate with their developed emotional intelligence, whether because of nature, nurture, or practice, bring an additional dimension of understanding and relationship building to their work projects. Some components of the interaction of an individual who has highly developed emotional intelligence were defined. All of these are 9 ideas about how to enhance your emotional intelligence in day-to-day practice. Practice deep and focused listening when communicating with another worker. Instead of rehearsing your reaction while the other person is speaking, focus your mind and attention on asking questions to clarify and understand what the person is saying. Sum up and give opinions about what you think you heard the individual say to you. Ask if your synopsis is an accurate portrayal of the communication content. Ask questions to recognize feelings and emotions. Ask the worker how he or she feels about the information provided to you. Ask for their gut feeling about how things are advancing. If you have problems reading how the worker is responding to a situation mentally, ask to find out. Most employees are only too happy to disclose an opinion when their supervisor shows interest. You will farther develop your emotional intelligence, too, by listening. Practice seeing nonverbal communication. Stop your rush long enough to recognize when nonverbal communication is inconsistent with the words spoken. Get used to analyzing body language as a means to comprehend a worker's complete communication. With practice, you're going to get better. Observe your own reactions to a staff member's communication. Make sure that you respond on 2 levels. You need to respond to the facts and to the underlying feelings, needs, dreams, etc. that are expressed in most interactions in case you are watchful. Again, if you don't get the second level that involves emotions, ask until you comprehend. Observe whether the workers with whom you relate most efficiently are like you. Explore whether you are getting shared communication or just making assumptions that the employee will feel and respond in a particular way based on your experience. Ask questions and notice responses. Remember, too, that you might attribute these employees with having more knowledge and insights based on your shared connection. Develop a sense of when you are being played. A worker with highly developed emotional intelligence is already evaluating your responses and comprehends what you want to hear. That staff member is knowledgeable at building the relationship side of your connection, for good and for ill. Pay more attention to your own emotions. Examine how you respond in emotional circumstances. Try to find opinions from workers whom you depend respond with some degree of objective, straight response. Seek added opinions from an employer or mentor who can define your impact on others in a meeting, for example. Developing emotional intelligence. You can develop your emotional intelligence, but it will take relentless focus and practice. Seek and use opinions to round out your own perceptions of your actions and habits. Emotional intelligence is a trademark of an efficient manager or leader. They understand and appropriately react to both the content of a message and the underlying emotion and significant components that make a message live and take in a company. They have the ability to build sustainable relationships with peers and reporting staff. Without any emotional intelligence, a leader is handicapped severely in their ability to view and react to the emotional element of communication and interaction and communication with other workers. That incapability will kill its effectiveness. Critical thinking skill. Nonverbal communication. Is there ever any kind of doubt in your mind regarding the mood of a coworker on their arrival on the job? Nonverbal communication is the single most effective form of communication. More than the voice or even words, nonverbal communication cues you into what's on yet another person's mind. The best communicators are sensitive to the power of emotions and thoughts communicated nonverbally. Nonverbal communication varies from facial expression to nonverbal communication. Gestures, signs, and use of space are also important in comprehending nonverbal communication. Multicultural differences in body language, facial expression, use of space, and particularly gestures are enormously available to misinterpretation. So, heed the need to become culturally sensitive before making an interpretation of body language that might or may not inform you of what the individual actually thinks. This also applies to other nonverbal analysis of a colleague's thinking or meaning. Many people are more sensitive to the meanings of nonverbal communication. Others are simply thinking. How much of an expert are you in understanding nonverbal communication? To determine your competence in translating nonverbal communication, take a look at the Nonverbal Communication Interpretation Quiz from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Each link leads to pictorial quiz questions and explanations. One of the funniest, yet at the same time saddest, nonverbal exchanges that was observed taken place in the registrar's office at a major university. An international student tried to communicate his issue to an older white woman. He gesticulated constantly, waving his hands to stress his communication. He tried to narrow the distance between himself and the university worker, who kept backing away to maintain her preferred amount of distance for her comfort. By the end of the discussion, the student was chasing her the length of the countertop, still gesturing with his hands heatedly. The worker, who obviously was not an expert at comprehending nonverbal communication or recognizing the cultural distinctions discussed earlier, was scared. She suggested in a later discussion that she had been horrified of the student who was solely trying to tell her that he had already footed the bill he had just received from the university. The importance of comprehending nonverbal communication. One research study at UCLA indicated that up to 93% of communication effectiveness is determined by nonverbal hints. Another study suggested that the impact of a performance was determined 7% by the words used, 38% by the voice quality, and 55% by the nonverbal communication. If you want to mask your feelings or your immediate response to info, pay very close attention to your nonverbal behavior. You might have your voice and words under control, but your nonverbal communication, including the tiniest facial expressions and movement, can give your true thoughts and feelings away. The majority of people are really open books, especially to a proficient reader of nonverbal hints. Regardless of your position at work, improving your ability in interpreting nonverbal communication will contribute to your capability to share meaning with another person. Shared meaning is a preferred meaning of communication. The right analysis of nonverbal communication will add depth to your capability to communicate. Tips for understanding nonverbal communication. Recognize that people communicate on many levels. Watch their facial expressions, eye contact, posture, hand and feet movements, body movement and positioning, and appearance and passage as they walk towards you. Virtually every gesture is communicating something if you listen with your eyes. Become accustomed to watching nonverbal communication, and your ability to read nonverbal communication will grow with practice. If an individual's words say one thing and their nonverbal communication says another, you are wont to listen to the nonverbal communication, and that is normally the right choice. Assess job candidates based upon their nonverbal communication. You can read volumes from how the applicant sits in the lobby. Nonverbal communication at the time of an interview should also clarify the prospect's skill, strong points, weaknesses, and concerns for you. Penetrate nonverbal communication throughout an investigation or other situation in which you need facts and credible declarations. Also, the nonverbal may reveal more than the person's spoken words. When leading a meeting or talking to a group, recognize that nonverbal cues can tell you when you've talked long enough, when another person wants to speak, and the mood of the crowd and their reaction to your remarks. Listen to them, and you will become a much better leader and a better speaker and communicator. Comprehending nonverbal communication enhances with practice. The first step is to recognize the power of nonverbal communication. You have undoubtedly experienced a time when you had the gut feeling that what a person said to you was incorrect. Listen to your gut. It's your way of taking in and analyzing every little thing you see and hear from a colleague's nonverbal communication, movement, the intonation, words, and whether or not all of these components of communication match. In addition to your life experiences, training, beliefs, and all that comprise your past, it's your internal professional on nonverbal communication. Critical thinking skill. Receive feedback without being offended. Are you fascinated by hearing about how others see your work and your contribution? If you are, make it easy for them to tell you. If they think you'll appreciatively consider their feedback, you are going to get lots more. Plus, that's a good idea, really. Thoughtful feedback helps you grow both personally and professionally. Accurate feedback helps you with your lifelong profession development also. It's a present that people who care about your personal and professional success can offer. But they will only supply feedback if you're approachable and enable them to feel comfortable giving you the feedback. Once they are rebuffed, quarreled with, or subjected to your defense conduct, colleagues and employers are not as likely to approach you again with useful feedback. When it pertains to colleagues who have the same objectives and direction as you, this is saddening, as you all need to gather for the good of the team. In the case of your boss, your defensiveness is even sadder. This is the person from whom you need to welcome feedback. It's difficult enough to be a supervisor who is in a position in which he or she must offer feedback. And it's already an uncomfortable role for many because they're untrained or ill-prepared. You would do very well not to make the circumstance much more difficult for your boss. How to receive feedback. These are the steps you really need to require to get feedback with grace and dignity. Try to control your defensiveness. Fear of hurting you or having to handle defensive or justifying behavior make people hesitant to give feedback to someone else. If you can develop an aura of approachability, people are more likely to return with more feedback. Defensiveness, anger, justifying, and excuse making will ensure that colleagues and employers are uncomfortable giving you feedback. Listen to understand. Practice all of the abilities of an efficient listener, consisting of using nonverbal communication and facial expressions that encourage the other person to talk. Try to suspend judgment. After all, in learning the views of the feedback supplier, you find out about yourself and how your actions are translated and seen in the world. Noted specialist and author Tom Peters, in a popular quote, said, "Perception is all there is." That holds true for your career development. How the world views you is a chance for ongoing development. Summarize and reflect what you hear. Your feedback company will appreciate that you're really hearing what they're saying, rather than using the little voice in your brain to argue, deny, or formulate your response. Focus on making certain that you comprehend the point of view you are receiving. You are also identifying the credibility of what you are really hearing. Ask questions to illustrate. Focus on questions to make sure that you comprehend the feedback. Once again, concentrate on comprehending the feedback you are receiving, not on your next response. Request for examples and stories that highlight the feedback, so that you know that you share meaning with the person providing feedback. Simply because a person gives you feedback doesn't mean their feedback is right or widely shared by other coworkers and employers. Remember that they see your actions but interpret them through their own perceptual screen and life experiences. Be friendly. Many people avoid giving feedback to those people who are bad-tempered and dismissive. Your openness to feedback appears through your nonverbal communication, facial expressions, and welcoming way. You can also ask for feedback verbally, asking questions like, "John, how did I do on that presentation? Was I clear?" Consult others to determine the reliability of the feedback you have received. If only someone believes it about you, it might be almost her or him, not you. This is a major step, as you always have the choice about whether to accept feedback and throw down the gauntlet or not. Remember, only you have the right and the ability to decide what to do with the feedback you have received. It is up to you to check it out with others, seek out examples, and then choose if the feedback is worth doing something about. Tips for gracefully receiving feedback. Here are added communication tips about how to receive feedback with grace and dignity. Try to show your gratitude to the person providing the feedback. They will feel encouraged, and actually, believe it or not, you do not want to motivate feedback. Even your manager or supervisor finds offering feedback creepy. They never ever know how the person receiving feedback is going to react. If you find yourself becoming defensive or hostile, practice tension management strategies, such as taking a deep breath and letting it out gradually. Concentrating on understanding the feedback by questioning and reiterating typically pacifies any emotions you have of animosity. If you actually disagree, are mad or upset, and want to discourage the other person of their opinion, wait until your feelings are under control to resume the discussion at a later date. Doing so at the moment of feedback is rampant with the potential for the whole discussion to struggle. This has been Critical Thinking. Improve Your Academic Standards and Objectivity by Marco Jameson. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Critical Thinking. Relevancy, Attributes, and Meaning by Marco Jameson. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1. Attributes and Meanings. Critical thinking can be defined as learning to think in a better way by enhancing a person's thinking skills. Individuals who are critical thinkers can use the thinking process to examine, consider, reflect on, and piece together what they have learned or are now learning. Regrettably, much of everyone's thinking tends to be prejudiced, inaccurate, uncertain, uninformed, or even sexist or racist. Since this becomes severely restricting, critical thinking is needed to improve its quality and value. Within the basics, critical thinking is necessary for getting rid of problems, making changes, or adaptations within work structures, techniques and problem-solving circumstances, resolving situational conflict and pressing concerns. Also, it can help with developing and implementing new ideas, methods, and solutions. Critical thinking development is a progressive process. It requires the following: mastering plateaus of cognitive development, and also keeping a serious focus on the process itself, changing personal practices of thought, which have the tendency to be a long-range project. Within the development of critical thinking, it is very important to recognize what does not comprise its fundamental components. Critical thinking is not achieved by saying something without carefully thinking it through, taking a guess at what one thinks ought to be done, memorizing topics to study, discuss, or take a look at random things, doing something simply because it has always been done, believing something because it is what everybody else tends to actually believe, or arguing about something when there are no real pieces of evidence to back the argument. There are lots of definitions to what is critical thinking. That's to be expected. Critical thinking incorporates much of what we do when we are using our brains. Words like thinking, translating, observation, and more are used to describe critical thinking. Expressions are also used, such as logical thinking, focused thinking, cognitive processes, reflective ideas, and informed opinions. Other expressions, such as examining info to obtain a judgment, are even used. Chapter 2. What are the benefits of critical thinking for you? There are 3 answers to that interesting question. Number 1. To make informed choices. Making smart choices is essential in your life. You have to select everything, from where to have tomorrow's lunch to what career to go after. The more you are able to use your experiences and knowledge, the better your choices are. Number 2. To comprehend. Your capability to comprehend something is another vital component of your life. You are exposed to a broad variety of information on television, the internet, books, magazines, and people around you. Comprehending things leads to opinions and decision-making. For instance, by reading more about and comprehending the positions of 2 political opponents, you are better equipped to make a nuanced choice on whom to vote for. Number 3. To develop, imagine, and discover. The capability to create, imagine, and discover are human traits that exist in all of us. We create stunning art, writing, music, and more. We create things like the light bulb, the computer system, and rockets. We discover things like E equals MC squared, penicillin, and DNA. The capability to create, imagine, and find all need decision making. It's an integral part of each process. There are decisions in picking a project. Whatever you pursue, there are choices along the way. The capability to make and perform informed decisions by effectively utilizing your life knowledge, experience, sound judgment, thinking, instincts, feelings, and confidence. Critical thinking needs self-control and self-examination. The rewards are great, like feeling free and the capability to finish projects, accomplish objectives, and answer questions with self-confidence. When you take charge of your mind by using critical thinking and make sound decisions, you organize your life. Critical thinking is a skill. It will be enhanced by anybody willing to stretch and grow. The brain acts like a muscle. If used properly, it grows. If it is avoided, it withers. Examples of critical thinking. A driver has to apply critical thinking when he or she is on the road. After asking a question, such as, "What is the best path to my destination?" the critical thinking process starts. First, the driver must reflect on the question and choose which route will get them to his or her location the fastest. After this, the driver must reach a particular solution or path to the issues at hand. Last but not least, the outcome of the driver's critical thinking will be a strong plan to follow through with. Choosing whether to go on another date with somebody also involves critical thinking. First of all, you have to choose whether another date will benefit you or not. You could think about the different outcomes that could happen and assess the downsides versus the gains. Eventually, a decision will be made from your judgments, and a definite result will follow. Critical thinking does, though, promote creativeness. The act of contemplating an idea, assessing that idea, and choosing a creative option is part of your child's progressing critical thinking abilities. Being able to observe and assess, make a judgment, and ultimately draw your conclusion is part of the needed steps towards solving any issue. In order to do that, you must have the ability to plan ahead, evaluate what-if scenarios, and choose which would be the best means of achieving the desired results. Teaching our kids the capability to think ahead can't be understated. Most children live in the here and now. Most kids don't make the effort to think too far into their future. In some respect, with the sexting that is going on, today's teens aren't either. I actually believe that if those teens had been exposed to some critical thoughts and processes earlier, they would have had the ability to see their actions ahead and assess, wow, this may not be a good thing to do. The ability to know the difference between a fact and a viewpoint is directly related to an individual's critical thinking skills. Possibly, that is why so many people today are falling for the rhetoric of today's political leaders rather than deciding for oneself. People who follow others are hardly ever critical thinkers. It does not take much thinking to follow a person in front of you. You just engage your feet and relocate. Exactly how many times did your mother say, "If John jumped off a bridge, would you do it too?" Obviously, you answered no. But how many of our kids today are following blindly after their leader, whether that leader is good or bad? Chapter 3. Relevant and Irrelevant Reasoning. We have already talked about one example of irrelevant reason in argument: the prosecuting lawyer arguing that the crime of which the offender is accused is particularly abhorrent when the question is if the offender actually committed the criminal offense. If the jury members are not cautious, they will find themselves agreeing that the crime truly was awful, and then concluding on the basis of that irrelevant reason that the offender must be guilty. The USA need for electrical energy will progressively increase over the following 3 decades or so. Is that claim relevant or unimportant to an argument about atomic energy? That is actually a trick question. It's impossible to say whether an important reason for a facility is relevant until the precise conclusion has been defined. Info that is of vital importance is proving one conclusion will be irrelevant to some other conclusion. In that case, what's the argument about? If the argument concerns the safety of nuclear power, then premises concerning increased need for power will be unimportant. Having said that, the conclusion being debated is a more general one. The development of more nuclear reactors is not an advantage. The information concerning forecasted power needs will definitely matter. Naturally, a facility can be relevant without being conclusive. In an argument over whether to build more nuclear power plants, it will certainly be very important to know whether more power is needed. If no new sources of power are required, then that will count against building power plants of any type, which includes nuclear. However, you may still conclude that we should not build more nuclear power plants. Perhaps they are simply too dangerous, even though that you recognize that the increased demand for power is a pertinent contemplation. If the problem is whether nuclear reactors pose a very serious threat to life and health, factors to consider of need for electrical power are unimportant. They are not always unimportant. Problems of generating enough power for an industrialized civilization are real and essential. However, such factors to consider are irrelevant to this particular problem of nuclear reactor security. Premises are relevant or unimportant relative to the conclusion. The key point to remember when considering the importance or irrelevance of premises is the following. Premises, reasons, and facts are not in themselves relevant or irrelevant. Rather, a facility, simple fact, or reason is important or an irrelevant relative to a particular conclusion. So before you can start judging the relevance or irrelevance of premises, you should first be sure of exactly what conclusion is the problem. When taking a look at an argument, first determine the precise conclusion. Then, when considering the premises of the argument, the reasons given in support of the conclusion, ask, would the truth of this premise make the conclusion more likely? Would the falsity of this premise make the conclusion not as likely? If the answers to those questions are yes, then the premise is relevant and actually contributes something to the argument. If the answers are no, then the premise is irrelevant. Chuck it aside, for it can only confuse the issue. Many long and fruitless arguments arise from the disputants plunging into an argument before identifying precisely what the argument is about. Consider this example from a Milwaukee jury room. In Wisconsin, it is a felony for an individual formerly convicted of a felony to knowingly have a gun. Under Wisconsin law, it doesn't matter what the intents of the defendant were in buying the gun, whether the founded guilty felon bought the gun for target practice or robbing banks or a wall decor is irrelevant to whether she or he broke the law. But even in such an apparently uncomplicated case, differentiating pertinent or unimportant reasons can be extremely complicated. In one case, the offender, a guy called Reed, was charged with the criminal activity defined above, being a founded guilty felon knowingly in possession of a firearm. The Wisconsin law mentions that an individual is guilty of that criminal offense if she or he, 1, has been convicted of a felony, 2, has a gun, and 3, knows that she or he possesses a gun. If a convicted felon purchased a scaled trunk at an auction without knowing it consisted of a pistol, then that person would not know that she or he possessed a weapon and hence would not be in infraction of the law. Reed's case was regrettable. Reed had been found guilty of a felony many years earlier. After his release from jail, he had lived a number of years without getting into any trouble. He was a man of low intelligence, a functional illiterate, obviously harmless. He had seen an advertisement for a training program for private detectives. Reed sent in several dollars and got a private investigator's badge, and that he always carried. Reed frantically wanted to find work that would enable him to help people. In pursuing this detective dream, Reed bought a pistol. While in a Milwaukee courtroom, he was unemployed and he usually passed his days around the courts. He showed a constable's deputy the receipt for the pistol he had purchased. When the deputy asked Reed to bring in the pistol, Reed immediately did so and was jailed. When the case went to the jury, they discussed long and hard about their decision. The jury debate focused on Reed. Most jurors claimed that Reed was safe and barely able to comprehend the charges against him. Certainly not aware that he was breaking the law by purchasing a pistol, and without any objective of breaking the law, carried away by the helpless fantasy of becoming an important and reputable private investigator who would fight for the ones that needed help. A guy whose objective was to help others and gain respect for himself, rather than to commit a crime or trigger harm. To many jurors, it seemed needlessly terrible to convict this regrettable man of the crime. Other members of the jury saw it in a different way. Reed's misfortunes are sad, but irrelevant. Under the law, there are only 3 conditions for being guilty of this charge. The offender must be a convicted felon, should possess a weapon, and should know that he is in possession of a weapon. That's all. Reed's intents might be good. He's probably rather harmless. And definitely his lot has been a pretty hard one. But all those concerns are unimportant. As the law is written, Reed is guilty. In fact, Reed's inclinations and misfortunes pertained to the conclusion being argued for by one side, and they related to the conclusion favored by the opposing jurors. One group of jurors was arguing that Reed's inclinations were irrelevant as inclinations are unimportant to whether one is guilty under this particular law. The proof presented in court revealed beyond a sensible doubt that Reed violated the law, and our job as a jury is just to decide whether or not the state has shown that Reed violated the law. For that reason, we should find Reed guilty. The other jurors concurred that Reed had broken the letter of the law, but they were saying that in this case, the precise application of the law led to an oppression. Reed was guilty of breaking the law, but Reed is also a diplomatic immunity in which it would be better just to make an exception. Thus, these jurors argued, Reed needs to be found not guilty. What are the different conclusions for which the two groups are arguing? One group is saying that Reed should be found guilty, and the other is saying he ought to be found not guilty. That's true, but it is not extremely handy. The different conclusions must be mentioned more precisely. One group is arguing Reed is guilty under the law, and our only role is to determine legal guilt or innocence, not to choose whether this outcome is fair or just or preferable. The other group is arguing Reed is guilty under the law, but we as a jury have an additional obligation to choose whether applying the law in this case is fair and just. Once the conclusions of the two groups are specified, it is possible to see the issue plainly that Reed is guilty under the law. The issue isn't Reed's guilt or innocence. Furthermore, both groups concur that Reed is an unfortunate and most likely harmless person, and that convicting him is really severe. Precisely, where is the argument? The disagreement is over the role of the jury. One group keeps that the function of the jury is strictly as a truth finder. If the jury is convinced that the prosecution showed the accused meets all of the needed conditions for being guilty of breaking a certain law, then the jury must return a verdict of guilty. The other group actually believes that the jury has an important role in addition to that of the fact finder. The jury must decide whether a law or its specific application is just and must stop oppressions from taking place. When the different conclusions are specified, then arguments can be concentrated on what's actually at problem. Should the jury stay with fact-finding and not question whether a certain law or application of law is just, leaving such problems to legal bodies? That isn't an easy question. There are some strong arguments, both pro and con. So being clear on exactly what is at issue does not really mean that it will then be simple to settle the problem. Yet, it does mean that arguments can be directed to what's really at problem. Both sides agree that the offender is guilty. That's no longer the point. So at this stage of the argument, points to show that the defendant is guilty just confuse the issue. Both sides concur that strict application of the law in this case is extremely harsh, but that also is now beside the point. The question is what role the jury should play in our system of justice. That is what the dispute switches on, and that is what should be argued. The Milwaukee jury frequently talked about whether the offender Reed knew that he was breaking the law. All agreed that he probably did not know. Some firmly insisted that was irrelevant, and others that it mattered and essential. Again, the significance or irrelevance of that point depends on what is at issue. It is irrelevant to the question of whether or not Reed actually broke the law. The law says it is a criminal offense for a convicted felon to intentionally have a weapon. It doesn't require that the person breaking the law knows that she or he is breaking the law. Even so, it relates to the question of whether convicting Reed would be treating him unjustly. It's not really fair to convict him if he had not the slightest idea he was doing anything wrong. Again, what points are and aren't appropriate is a function of the conclusion. By the way, in the actual case in Milwaukee, the jury members finally chose that rigorous application of the law was in this case unfair, and that as a jury, they are supposed to stop unjust applications of the law, and they voted unanimously for an innocent verdict. Consider a case from outside the courtroom. Just right before the 1984 Olympics, the Mars Candy Company ran commercials demonstrating sports players chomping chocolate and caramel bars and specifying that such candy bars gratified their hunger in the mid-morning or mid-afternoon after a really tough training session. If the conclusion is that a sweet bar will briefly please cravings, then there is a relatively good support for that quite minor conclusion. If instead the conclusion is that candy bars as a whole are some part of a pretty good diet, and that it is a good thing for athletes in training to eat a couple of candy bars a day, as the commercials certainly implied, then the simple fact that eating a candy bar briefly pleases appetite is irrelevant to that conclusion. The point is that to decide the relevance and strength of the sensible, you must first be certain of the conclusion. And if you keep the conclusion clearly in mind, You should not have way too much trouble choosing whether the premises support the conclusion or whether they are instead unimportant. Unimportant factor fallacy. The fallacy of unimportant reason is committed when the reasons given in support of a conclusion are irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion. The reasons given could hold true. They could be very important in other contexts. They may even deserve celebration, but they have no bearing on the question at problem, and including them in the argument puzzles the problem. Definitely, an axe murder is a horrible thing, and all of us deplore such vicious criminal activities. But that's what the question problem is. Did the defendant do that terrible deed? If unimportant points, like the awful nature of the lethal needle injected into the conversation, then attention might be distracted to the horror of the criminal activity and from the problem. The power of unimportant reasons to draw people of the right trail has triggered the unimportant reason fallacy to what's sometimes called a much different and rather catchy name, the red herring fallacy. The red herring fallacy. The precise source of the red herring name for irrelevant reason is unidentified, but at least there's a great story. After a fox hunt, cooked herring turns reddish when prepared, was dragged across the path of the fox when the hunt was ended. The strong smell of the herring made the hounds lose the path and probably their lunch, and thus the hounds could be caught easily. The red herring distracts the hounds from the correct course and sends them off the aroma. And that's exactly what a red herring, an unimportant reason, is in an argument. It sidetracks people from what's really at issue and sends them off on unimportant pursuits. If the argument's over whether pistols should be prohibited, it pertains to consider how many people have been killed in handgun mishaps. But suppose somebody then asserts, everybody speaks about pistol accidents, but think of how many people are killed year after year in auto accidents. Why don't we banish automobiles? You should hold your breath and cover your nose and stay on the trail, for a red herring has just been dragged across the argument. The risk of auto mishaps is definitely serious, and maybe on another occasion we should go over how to minimize that danger. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the question of prohibiting pistols. Whether there are other inappropriate risks in civilization isn't the problem. The question is instead whether handguns pose an unacceptable risk. Maybe they do, maybe they do not. But no progress will be made on that problem if the arguers are distracted by irrelevant reasons. Remember, the first thing to ask when considering an argument is, what is the conclusion? What is this argument supposed to be showing? What is at issue? With the conclusion securely in mind, you will not be tempted down unimportant sidetracks, no matter how luring and true and essential they could be. Surely, it is true and essential that society needs to be safeguarded from vicious axe killers. But if you remember that the question is not the proper disposal of axe murderers, but rather the guilt or innocence of the offender, then such unimportant reasons won't divert you. One other point. Determining the relevance of a property isn't the exact same as identifying its truth. A true premise definitely can be unimportant, as noted in several examples, but also a false premise may be relevant. For instance, everybody who plays the lotto wins $1 million. I wish to win $1 million. Therefore, I should play the lotto. The first premise is relevant, and its falsity does not diminish its significance. So, in figuring out significance or irrelevance, don't ask whether the premise is really true. Instead, ask whether it matters for the question, which is the issue if the premise is very true or incorrect. If it does not make any distinction one way or the other, then the premise is unimportant. The burden of evidence. The primary step in critically analyzing an argument is identifying the conclusion. The second step is identifying who bears the burden of proof. I declare that extraterrestrials have built a remarkable undersea city deep in the Pacific Ocean. They are mining natural deposits from below the ocean floor and carrying these resources back to their home planet through a fleet of interstellar freight ships. You have doubts about the existence of this ET city and challenge me to define its location. I can't, but I'm sure it exists. You request photos of the city. I have none. Are there unusual discoveries from oceanographic research that would suggest the presence of such a deep sea metropolitan area? I have no such information. Are there any reliable witnesses who have seen this city? None. But I am firm in my claim. Look, the Pacific Ocean is huge and deep, and most of the ocean floor is uncharted. If you are so skeptical about the undersea city, then prove that it does not exist. And if you cannot prove that the ocean floor does not include such a city, then that is strong proof that such a city exists. At the very least, you should keep an open mind about the possibility of such a city, and put your skepticism aside. Who bears the burden of evidence? You aren't likely to believe the existence of an ocean bottom ET city as a consequence of this flimsy argument. There was no real proof for the claim, and anybody making a claim or an accusation bears the burden of proof. The person making the claim must prove it all. It isn't up to others to prove it incorrect. The fallacy of a ballo grande is committed when somebody argues that as her or his claim cannot be proved false. Because of this, it should be accepted as true. But the fact that a claim can't be shown to be incorrect is no premise for believing it to be true. And it doesn't prove that it isn't true. It might be true, though it is not proved so. However, failure to prove a claim false isn't proof of the claim's truth. Attempts to shift the burden of evidence are common. In 1988, TV evangelist Pat Robertson made a not successful run for President of the United States. Throughout his project, he claimed that there were, or at least may be, Soviet missiles in Cuba. Since all indicators from the spy satellites, for instance, were that there were no such rockets, the question naturally developed as to what evidence the Reverend Robertson could offer for his significant claim. Having none, Robertson attempted to shift the burden of proof to the opposite side. Intelligence's claims were supported by the fact that United States intelligence could not conclusively prove that no such rockets existed in Cuba, and naturally, Robertson was partially right. Neither the U.S. Intelligence Service nor anybody else could conclusively prove that there was no Soviet rockets cleverly hidden deep in some Cuban cavern or hidden in some other unidentified and unspecified location. But that definitely does not corroborate Robertson's claim, no more than the fact that we can't prove that no brontosauruses live in caverns deep beneath New Orleans proves the existence of subterranean brontosauruses, and no greater than the fact that we cannot prove that there are definitely no extraterrestrials disguised as Earthlings proves that we are in the midst of extraterrestrials. The person making the claim of Soviet missiles, brontosauruses, or extraterrestrials bears the burden of proof. The appeal to lack of knowledge. The sensationalist tabloids have a field day with the attract lack of knowledge. They publish scandalous allegations concerning the lives and enjoys of motion picture stars and political leaders, and then, in support of those stories, they explain that 2 weeks ago we published a special story about I'm a Star's torrid love affair with the ambassador to Rutabaga. If it is not true, they should deny it. But since they have not denied it, much less offered any proof that it is incorrect, then it must hold true. But I'm a star, and the ambassador are caught in a bind. If they overlook the story, several people will really believe it. But most will overlook it and it will quickly pass, since none of the significant newspapers or TV networks will consider the story reliable. Still, if they deny the story, then that is news. When a film star and an ambassador problem declarations, the press considers it newsworthy, and those denials, along with the charges being denied, will receive national news coverage, and the story will not blow over rapidly. So even if there isn't a grain of truth to the charges, it's not likely that a rejection will be released. And more to the point, it's not up to them to prove the charges false. Think for a moment of how challenging it would be to prove that you did not have a secret love affair with someone. The burden of proof rests on those making the charges. A variation on this problem happens when a snake oil salesman, for instance, someone touting the incredible healing powers of magnets, challenges the medical community to dispute. I've proposed that a panel of prominent medical scientists and doctors take a look at the terrific benefits of my solumagnetomed system. And I have offered to meet them any place and give my evidence. I challenge them to discuss it with me, but they keep declining. So why will not the AMA assemble a panel to dispute the fantastic new magnetic health system? For two reasons. First and foremost, such systems have already been taken a look at carefully and found to be useless. And if researchers took up each new variation of such quackery, they would have no time at all for legitimate research. And second, if a panel of prominent medical researchers and physicians consult with this quack, even to roundly condemn it as a fraud, he will instantly include it in his marketing, and it will greatly increase his reliability. Try my new solumagnetomed system, and that was just recently the focus of a full AMA-sponsored conference, drawing the attention of such recognized scientists. Also, you understand, if lawful scientists and doctors appear on the same platform with such quacks, it gives the quacks instantaneous reliability. Prominent medical researchers believe it is definitely worth taking this new magnetic treatment system seriously, and its developer is seated on the same panel with lawful scientists, just one leading medical scientist, to name a few. The real burden of evidence in the courtroom. There is a special setting in which it is vitally important to recall who bears the burden of evidence. And in this setting, regrettably, the fallacy of appeal to lack of knowledge accompanies frightening regularity. The jury room. It is now a foundation of the American and British systems of criminal justice that a defendant is innocent till proven guilty. And in fact, the principle of assumption of innocence was already a vital component of English law when the earliest British inhabitants gotten here in the American groups, and this can be found in the earliest rules of legal process formulated by the British colonists in New England. The General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony voted in 1657 that, whereas in all civil cases, depending in suit, the party affirmed that the offender hath done him wrong, and accordingly presents his case for judgment and fulfillment, it behooveth the court and jury to see that the affirmation be proved by enough evidence, else the case must be found for the defendant, and so it is also in a criminal case, for in the eye of the law each man is truthful and innocent unless it be proved legally to the contrary. And the concept that the burden of showing guilt rests on the prosecution went on to be a feature of colonial American judicial procedure, even when, as in the witchcraft trials, Courts were not specifically mindful concerning the quality of evidence. Presumption of innocence. Why is the presumption of innocence so essential? Most importantly, since it is just the correct way of thinking. The burden of proof rightly belongs on the party that makes the claim. Whether that claim is a pharmaceutical company's claim that a new drug is safe and efficient, or a tabloid's claim that extraterrestrials are hiding in Mammoth Cavern, or the state's claim that an individual committed a crime. If the proof can be provided, fine. But failure to either prove or disprove the claim is just that, a failure to prove anything. And that leaves the security of the drug in doubt and the guilt of the defendant unestablished. There is a second reason the burden of evidence lies with the one making the claim. If one were permitted to interest ignorance, attract the failure to disprove the claim, to prove a claim, then one would have the ability to prove the most remarkable things. This is an example. It is quite unrealistic to prove that there is not a group of unnoticeable extraterrestrials lurking in the depths of the Indian Ocean. But we should be loath to count that as proving the presence of such entities. It is not possible to prove that Rousseau never ever had a really secret love affair with Marie Antoinette, but lack of disproof of such an affair does not prove that such a tryst took place. More to the point, imagine trying to prove that you're innocent of a strangling murder that happened at 11 o'clock p.m. 3 years ago. Unless you keep an extremely good journal, you most likely don't have an exact recollection of where you were at the time, much less a persuading alibi. Even if you definitely remember remaining in the college library with a good friend all that night, will your friend remember it? And will your good friend be absolutely certain that you didn't leave for maybe a half an hour around 11 p.m., just long enough to commit the foul crime of murder? In simple fact, if failure to negate the charges were counted as proof of those charges, then we would never ever have an unsolved criminal offense. Practically any crime that happened could be proved by attract ignorance against some unfortunate reclusive person who wasn't seen by anyone throughout the time of the crime. Such attract ignorance definitely has benefits. They have to borrow Bertrand Russell's phrase, all the benefits of theft over truthful labor. There is another reason for favoring a strong presumption of innocence. It has to do with logic, and more with our concepts of individual flexibility and justice. Our company believe that the rights and freedom of the individual are fundamental, and we oppose sacrificing individual rights and independence for the benefit of the state. For that reason, the general presumption must be that the individual's rights and liberty should not be interfered with. Any identical of individual liberty through criminal sanctions needs powerful overriding reasons and the strongest and most conclusive proof. Placing the burden of proof on the accused breaches principles of liberty and logic. What is involved in the assumption of innocence for the accused? Most certainly, the offender doesn't have to prove anything. The full burden of proof rests on the prosecution, and if the prosecution leaves a reasonable doubt after the presentation of its case, the defense need not do anything at all. And if the prosecution has managed to make a strong argument for the guilt of the offender, the defendant need not absolutely shatter that argument. Instead, the defense need only show that the prosecution's argument is not quite convincing. The offender need not establish his or her innocence. Unless the prosecution can build a case that both strongly establishes the accused's guilt and holds up against all efforts by the defense to raise doubts about the case, then the jury should conclude that the prosecution has not proved its case and ought to, because of this, vote not guilty. When the offender does not affirm. The assumption of innocence is a standard concept of logic and of Anglo-American criminal law. But jurors, in some cases, forget the concept. They reverse the order and demand that the defendant prove he's innocent or clear herself of the charges. And there's a more subtle way in which errors are made about the burden of evidence in criminal procedures. When the offender does not testify in her or his own behalf, many jurors weigh that extremely heavily against the accused. But the defendant has no commitment to testify. It isn't the responsibility of the offender to prove innocence. The full burden of proof rests on the prosecution. British, Canadian, and USA courts recognize that the defendant has no obligation to affirm on her or his own behalf, and judges on both sides of the Atlantic beware to remind jurors that the choice of a defendant not to testify in no other way counts against the defendant. However, all too frequently, the offender's decision not to affirm does develop a presumption against him because of the fallacious reasoning of some jurors. Jurors are apt to think that he didn't clear himself of the charges, so he must be guilty, or if he were innocent, he would want to take the stand and deny the charges, so he must be guilty. Or maybe they continue to give lip service to the concept that the offender need not testify, but in their actual deliberations, they might still count the accused's non-testimony against the offender. A previous New York district attorney overheard this remark from several jurors discussing their verdict. Obviously, we could not take it against him, but we knew he was guilty since he was scared to testify. However, that is pure appeal to ignorance. He hasn't proved the charges false, so they must hold true. Till the end of the 19th century, accused in British criminal cases were not permitted to affirm in their own behalf. The Bad Guy Proof Act of 1898 gave the offender the right, if he or she chose, to be positioned under oath and give testament. There are many clear advantages to such a significant change, and no doubt it is on the entire a great enhancement in trial process and a salutary extension of the rights of the individual. Even so, it is by no means an unmixed true blessing. As was pointed out by Mr. Justice Avery, a highly prestigious judge who presided at London's Old Bailey in the early 20th century. During his instructions to the jury at the end of a case in which the defendant had not testified, Mr. Justice Avery noted that, before that act, the Lawbreaker Evidence Act of 1998, no one ever lost sight of that grand principle of our criminal law that no man is accountable to be found guilty unless the prosecution has gratified the jury beyond any sensible doubt of his guilt. The moment the law was modified, there was a threat that if a man entered into the witness box, the jury may think it was for him to establish his innocence. And after that act, there was also a threat that by not entering into the witness box, the accused may lead the jury to conclude that the accused is unable to establish innocence. And that is a similarly mistaken variation of misplacing the burden of proof and committing the fallacy of interest ignorance. Juries and the burden of evidence. Consider where the burden of evidence lies in this fictional example of a jury dispute. The accused is charged with the criminal possession of a forbidden drug. Two detaining policemen affirm that they chased after and caught the offender, took him to the police headquarters, but didn't find the drug on the defendant. The police then, so they affirmed, returned to the scene of the arrest and found a packet of tablets of the prohibited drug, which the police claimed the offender had thrown away when he was caught. The defendant denies ever having actually possessed the drugs and denies any knowledge of the tablets. After long discussion, The members of the jury agree, appropriately or wrongly, that a person put the drugs where they were found, and that it must have been either the defendant who tossed them there or the cops who planted them to prove the defendant guilty. At this time, an argument develops, and one member of the jury argues hence. Look, the question boils down to this. Do we believe the statement of the cops or the testimony of the offender? It seems to me quite possible that the offender is telling the truth, and the police officers are attempting to frame him. Even so, it definitely seems more likely that the defendant is lying, and the police officers are telling the truth. Since we have to actually believe one or the other, it seems only realistic to accept the most likely story. And since the authority's story is the more likely to be true, we should accept it. And if we accept the police account, clearly we must find the offender regrets. What do you think of that argument? How would you clarify what's wrong with it to your fellow jurors? If it were only a question of which position is more credible, then it could be an efficient argument. That is, if it were a question of deciding whether it is more likely that the accused discarded the carpets at the scene of the arrest or more likely that the authorities planted them, then the police account is more likely. But that isn't the question. Framing the problem that way loses the burden of evidence. Instead of the burden of evidence resting squarely on the prosecution where it belongs, the argument puts it similarly on the prosecution and the defense. The appropriate question is not which side appears more credible, rather than the question is if the prosecution showed its case past a reasonable doubt. Even if you agree with the juror that the cop's story is more likely to be true, that's far from enough. It's insufficient for the prosecution to establish that case is more plausible. Rather, the prosecution must forecast a reasonable doubt that its account of the accused's guilt is really true. The defense need not show that its variation of the events is more likely to be true than the version given by the prosecution. Instead, the defense need only show that there is a sensible doubt that the prosecution's case is very true. Anytime a claim is made that a sweetening agent is safe, that an arthritis solution works, that an individual is guilty of a crime, the burden of evidence rests on those making the claim. Share and share alike might be excellent advice in some contexts, but it is poor reasoning and fallacious reasoning when attempting to locate the burden of proof. Uninviting ignorance. A warning. Appeals to ignorance do occur with dismal regularity, but be careful that you do not start seeing the fallacy when it's not truly there. The fallacy of appeal to lack of knowledge is a very particular fallacy. It happens only when one claims that a claim is true, since it has not been proved incorrect. Not all ignorant statements and silly arguments commit the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. If I claim that evil spirits trigger illness, that will expose my deep ignorance of contemporary medication. It is not, however, the fallacy of one to ignorance unless I contend that fiends should cause sickness, as nobody has been able to conclusively prove that fiends are not the reason for illness. If one asserts that unnoticeable Martians live in the sewers under New York City, you may well be justified in concluding that I am an ignorant, perhaps totally bats, but you should be wrong to charge me with the fallacy of interest ignorance. For I am not abling to ignorance. I might be ignorant, and that is regrettable, but it isn't a fallacy. In order to commit the fallacy of appeal to lack of knowledge, I should actually make that appeal. I would need to reason that there are unnoticeable Martians in the New York sewage systems, that nobody has had the ability to prove that there are none. So not all claims made in lack of knowledge commit the fallacy of interest ignorance. On the other side of the coin, A person could commit the fallacy of appeal to lack of knowledge without being an oblivious person. Intelligent and knowledgeable individuals may easily end up being baffled about where the burden of proof belongs on some particular issue, and thus might commit the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. To stay away from that fallacy, keep a careful watch on exactly what conclusion is being claimed and who is making the claim. Anybody who makes the claim, brings the accusation, or asserts the notion bears the burden of showing it to be true. This has been Critical Thinking, Relevancy, Attributes, and Meaning by Marco Jameson, narrated by J.A. Leidig. Critical Thinking, Inductive and Deductive Reasoning Explained by Marco Jameson, narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1: Fallacies and their definition. A fallacy is a type of error in reasoning. Fallacies might be made accidentally, or they could be created intentionally in order to deceive other people. The huge majority of the commonly identified fallacies include arguments, although some include clarifications or definitions or other items of thinking. Sometimes the term fallacy is used much more broadly to suggest any false belief or reason for a false belief. The list below includes some fallacies of these sorts, but most are fallacies that include kinds of mistakes made while arguing informally in natural language. A charge of fallacious thinking always needs to be justified. The burden of evidence is on your shoulders when you declare that a person's reasoning is fallacious. Even if you don't clearly give your reasons, it is your responsibility to be able to provide if challenged. An informal fallacy is fallacious just because of both its form and its content. The formal fallacies are fallacious only simply because of their rational form. For example, the domino effect fallacy has the following form. Step 1 typically leads to Step 2. Step 2 usually results in Step 3. Step 3 usually causes until we reach a certain desirable step. So Step 1 is not acceptable. That form takes place in both good arguments and fallacious arguments. The quality of an argument of this form depends most importantly on the likelihoods. The probabilities include the argument's content, not only its form. The first recognized organized research study of fallacies was because of Aristotle in his De Sophisticis Elenchis, Sophistical Refutations, an appendix to the topics. He listed 13 types. After the Dark Ages, fallacies were again studied methodically in medieval Europe. That's why so many fallacies have Latin names. The third major period of research study of the fallacies started in the later 20th century as a result of restored interest from the disciplines of philosophy, logic, communication research studies, rhetoric, psychology, and AI. The more frequent the mistake within public conversation and discussion, the more likely it is to have a name. That is one reason that there is no particular name for the fallacy of subtracting 5 from 13 and concluding that the answer is 7, though the error is very common. The term fallacy is not a precise term. One reason is that it is ambiguous. It can refer to either A, a sort of error in an argument, B, a kind of error in thinking, including arguments, meanings, clarifications, and so forth, C, a false belief. Or D, the reason for any of the previous errors, including what are usually referred to as rhetorical techniques. Philosophers who are scientists in fallacy theory choose a highlight, A, but their lead is usually not followed in textbooks and public discussion. Regarding D, disease, being a bigot, being hungry, being stupid, and being hypercritical of the adversaries are all sources of mistake in reasoning, so they could certify as fallacies of kind D, but they are not included in the list below. Then again, wishful thinking, stereotyping, being superstitious, justifying, and having a bad sense of percentage are sources of error and are included in the list right below, though they wouldn't be included in a list devoted only to faulty arguments. Hence, there is a specific arbitrariness to what appears in lists like this. What have been ended up in the list below are the following persuasive methods typically used to influence others and to cause errors in thinking: apple polishing, using propaganda methods, ridiculing, being cynical, choosing terms with strong negative or positive associations, using innuendo, and weaseling. All of the techniques are well worth understanding about if one wants to reason well. In describing the fallacies right below, the culture is followed of not distinguishing between a reasoner using a misconception and the thinking itself containing the fallacy. Real arguments are often ingrained within a long conversation. Richard Watley, one of the best of the 19th century researchers into informal reasoning, carefully said, "A very long discussion is just one of the most effective veils of fallacy. A fallacy, which when mentioned barely, wouldn't deceive a kid, may deceive half the world if watered down in a quart volume." 2. Taxonomy of fallacies. There are certain competing and overlapping ways to categorize fallacies of argumentation. For instance, they can be categorized as either official or informal. An official fallacy can be detected by examining the sensible form of the thinking, whereas a casual fallacy relies on the content of the reasoning and potentially the purpose of the reasoning. That is, casual fallacies are errors of reasoning that cannot quickly be expressed in our system of formal logic, such as symbolic, deductive, assert reasoning. The list right below consists of just a few official fallacies. Fallacious arguments also can be categorized as deductive or inductive, relying on whether the fallacious argument is most properly assessed by deductive requirements or instead by inductive requirements. Deductive standards need deductive credibility, yet inductive requirements require inductive strength, like making the conclusion more likely. Fallacies can be separated into classifications according to the mental elements that lead people to use them, and they can also be separated into classifications according to the epistemological or rational elements that cause the error. In the latter division, there are three categories. 1. The reasoning is invalid, but is presented just as if it were a legitimate argument, or else it is inductively much weaker than it is shown as being. 2. The argument has an unjustified premise. Or 3. Some relevant evidence has been neglected or suppressed. Regarding 2, a property can be justified or called for at a time even if we later learn that the premise was false, and it can be warranted if we're reasoning about what would have happened even when we know it didn't happen. Comparable fallacies are often organized together under a common name intended to draw out how the fallacies are comparable. Here are 3 examples. Fallacies of significance include fallacies that occur because of reliance on an unimportant reason. In addition, ad hominem, appeal to pity, and verifying the consequent are some other fallacies of significance. accent, amphiboly, and equivocation are examples of fallacies of obscurity. The fallacies of illegitimate presumption include asking the question, false issue, no true Scotsman, complex question, and repressed evidence. Notice how these classifications don't fall nicely into just one of the categories 1, 2, and 3 above. 3. Pedagogy. It is typically claimed that giving a fallacy a name and studying it will help the student recognize the fallacy in the future and will steer them away from using the fallacy in their own thinking. As Steven Pinker says in The Stuff of Thought, page 129. If a language offers a label for a complicated principle, that could make it much easier to think about the concept, as the mind can manage it as a single package when juggling a set of ideas, instead of needing to keep each of its parts in the air separately. It can also give a concept an extra label in long-lasting memory, making it more easily retrievable than ineffable principles or the ones with more paraphrastic verbal descriptions. For pedagogical purposes, scientists in the field of fallacies disagree about the following subjects. Which name of a misconception is more helpful to students' understanding? Whether some fallacies should be de-emphasized in favor of others, and which is the best taxonomy of the fallacies. Fallacy concept is criticized by some teachers of casual thinking for its overemphasis on poor thinking rather than good thinking. Do colleges teach the calculus by stressing all of the ways one can make mathematical mistakes? The critics really want more focus on the forms of good arguments and on the implicit guidelines that govern proper conversation created to solve a difference of opinion. But there has been little systematic research of which the focal point is more successful. Number 4. What is a fallacy? Scientists disagree about how to define the very term fallacy. Focusing just on fallacies in sense A from above, namely fallacies of argumentation. Some scientists define a misconception as an argument that is deductively invalid, or that it has very little inductive strength. As examples of incorrect problem, inconsistent premises, and asking the question are valid arguments in this sense. This definition really misses some standard fallacies. Other researchers say a fallacy is a mistake in an argument that emerges from something aside from merely incorrect premises. Yet, the false dilemma fallacy is because of incorrect premises. Still, other researchers define a misconception as an argument that is not that good. Good arguments are then described as those that are deductively legitimate or inductively strong, and that include only true, well-established premises, but are not question-begging. A grievance with this definition is that its requirement of truth would incorrectly lead to calling way too much scientific thinking fallacious. Every time a new scientific discovery triggered researchers to label a previously reputable claim as incorrect, all the scientists who used that claim as a facility would end up being fallacious reasoners. That consequence of the definition is acceptable to some scientists, but not to others. Because informal reasoning frequently handles hypothetical thinking, and with premises, for which there is great disagreement about whether they hold true or false, many researchers would unwind the requirement that every premise should be true. One commonly accepted definition specifies a fallacious argument as one that either is deductively invalid or is inductively extremely weak, or includes an unjustified premise, or that ignores appropriate evidence that's readily available and that should be understood by the arguer. Finally, yet another theory of fallacy says a fallacy is a failure to offer adequate proof for a belief, the failure being disguised to make the evidence look sufficient. Other scientists suggest identifying a fallacy as a violation of the standards of good reasoning. The rules of critical discussion, conflict resolution, and adequate communication. The difficulty with this approach is that there is so much dispute about how to identify these standards. In addition, all of the above descriptions are usually augmented with some comment to the impact that the fallacies are likely to convince many reasoners. It is infamously difficult to be really accurate about this unclear and subjective idea of being likely to convince, and some researchers in fallacy theory have because of that suggested dropping the idea in favor of can be used to persuade. Some scientists complain that all of the above descriptions of fallacy are too broad and don't see the difference between simple blunders and actual fallacies, the more serious errors. Scientists in the field of being deeply separated not only about how to specify the term fallacy and how to define some of the individual fallacies, but also about whether any general theory of fallacies at all have to be went after if that theory's objective is to supply necessary and sufficient conditions for distinguishing between fallacious and non-fallacious thinking generally. Analogously, there's doubt in the field of principles whether scientists should pursue the objective of providing needed and adequate conditions for distinguishing ethical actions from unethical ones. Number 5. Other controversies. How do we protect the claim that an item of thinking should be labeled as a certain fallacy? A major objective in the field of causal logic is offer some criteria for each fallacy. Schwartz presents the obstacle this way. Fallacy labels have their use, but fallacy-labeled texts tend not to supply beneficial requirements for applying the labels. Take the so-called ad verecundiam fallacy, the fallacious interest authority. Just when is it committed? Some appeals to authority are fallacious, most are not. A fallacious one meets the following condition. The expertise of the putative authority or the relevance of that expertise to the point at issue are in question. However, the work comes in judging and demonstrating that this condition holds, and that is where the fallacy-labeled texts end. Or rather, when a text goes further, stating clear, precise, broadly relevant criteria for using fallacy labels, it provides a very critical instrument, more basic than a taxonomy of fallacies, and for this reason, to that level exceeds the fallacy label technique. The more it enters this direction, the less it needs to stress or event to use fallacy labels. The debate here is the degree to which it is better to teach students what Schwartz calls the critical instrument than to teach the fallacy label method. Is the fallacy label method better for some kind of fallacies than others? If so, which others? Another debate includes the relationship between the fields of reasoning and rhetoric. In the field of rhetoric, the primary objective is to convince the audience. The audience is not going to be convinced by any otherwise good argument with true premises, unless they believe those premises hold true. Theorists tend to de-emphasize this difference between rhetoric and causal logic, and they focus on arguments that should struggle to convince the ideally rational reasoner rather than on arguments that are very likely not to convince audiences who hold certain background beliefs. Given particular pedagogical objectives, how pedagogically efficient is this de-emphasis? Advertising in magazines and on TV is created to attain visual persuasion. An embrace or the fanning of fumes from newly baked donuts out on the walkway are periodically used for visceral persuasion. There's some controversy among researchers In informal reasoning regarding whether the thinking associated with this nonverbal persuasion can always be assessed appropriately by the exact same standards that are used for verbal reasoning. Chapter 2: Inductive and Deductive Reasoning. We can see the difference between critical reading and critical thinking in the following way. Critical reading is a technique for discovering info and ideas within a text. Critical thinking is a technique for assessing information and ideas, for deciding what to accept and really believe. Critical reading describes a mindful, active, reflective, analytic reading. Critical thinking involves reflecting on the validity of what you have just read in light of our prior knowledge and understanding of the world. For instance, consider the following somewhat funny sentence from a student essay. Parents are buying costly cars and trucks for their children to ruin them. As the terms are used here, critical readers are concerned with determining whether within the context of the text as a whole, them describes the parents or caretakers, the kids or the cars and trucks, and if the text supports that practice. Critical thinking would come into play when determining if the chosen meaning was indeed true and whether or not you, as the reader, should support that practice. By these descriptions, critical reading would appear to come before critical thinking. Only once we have fully comprehended a text, critical reading, we can truly assess its assertions, critical thinking. The two together in harmony. In real practice, critical reading and critical thinking work together. Critical thinking allows us to monitor our understanding as we read. If we see that assertions are absurd or irresponsible, critical thinking, we take a look at the text more closely to check our understanding, critical reading. On the other hand, critical thinking depends upon critical reading. You can think critically about a text, critical thinking, after all, only if you comprehended it well, critical reading. We may decide to accept or decline a presentation, and yet we must know why. We have an obligation to ourselves, as well as to others, to isolate the real issues of agreement or disagreement. Only then can we understand and appreciate other individuals' views. To recognize and comprehend those views, we should read critically. Thinking is the psychological routine, the act and the capability to produce thoughts. People think of practically all things and anything. They often think of people, things, places, and anything without a reason or as a result of a trigger or a stimulus. In the meantime, critical thinking typically suggests thinking of thinking. In a sense, it is a deeper form of thinking of a certain problem or situation before actually deciding and acting. Inductive and deductive thinking. So, inductive reasoning doesn't guarantee true conclusions. That is intriguing and possibly disturbing. Inductive thinking underlies our anticipation that the earth will rotate to create a tomorrow, and we want to think tomorrow is a certainty. So let's explore this particular issue of certainty of a conclusion and inductive reasoning in a general sense. And let's do that through a contrast with other major kinds of thinking, example, deductive. Now, one frequently mentioned contrast between the two highlights general versus particular. One particular example is deductive reasoning. It is said to follow the general to the particular, while inductive thinking is proceeding in the opposite direction, from the particular to the general. That contrasting does give some insights and can prove true in some cases, or many cases. However, not always. For instance, in geometry, we use deductive reasoning to indicate that the angles of all triangles in a Euclidean space amount to 180 degrees, And we also make use of deductive reasoning to show that for all right triangles, again in a Euclidean space, the sum of the squares of the two much shorter sides equals the square of the longer side. For inductive reasoning, we may observe our pet and notice that certain foods are chosen over others, and hence generalize as to what foods to purchase or not to buy for our family pet. We make no claims or conclusions about the animals of others. Hence, we use deductive logic to prove a general statement, and inductive logic to reach a conclusion about one specific animal. The general and specific descriptions don't quite offer a right delineation of deductive and inductive logic. We need a more strenuous characterization. Deductive reasoning, more carefully, involves use of thinking structures where the reality of the premises rationally generate the real truth of the conclusion. In deductive reasoning, the construction of the proof reasoning and the syntactic plan of the piece parts ensure that true foundations of reasoning create true conclusions. Why is that? In its most extreme form, deductive logic floats out in a symbolic ether, consisting of just variables, statements, and reasoning operators. So, in its real form, deductive logic isn't about anything. Rather, it is a system of proof. Now, in daily life, we insert real-life objects. This is an example. We may construct a deductive proof as follows. Samantha is a human. A human is mortal. Samantha must be mortal. Inductive reasoning thus includes our taking info and teasing out conclusions, and such thinking works because of the consistency of our universe. But why does not this guarantee a true conclusion? What's going on here? Absolutely nothing in a practical sense. Rather, the problem is one of an official, rational structure. Particularly, what presumption lies behind inductive conclusions? What do we presuppose will hold true? Think about it. Inductive reasoning presumes that past patterns will anticipate future patterns, that what we observe now shows us what will be the case in the future. But that assumption and that presupposition itself represents an inductive conclusion. We presume past patterns will foretell future patterns in a provided case due to our experience and observations, both officially and in everyday life. And they have led us to a meta conclusion that, in a general sense, what we observe and now know provides a guide to what we have yet to observe and know. So we have made a meta conclusion that our world acts in a consistent way. And this meta conclusion isn't a bad thing. Humanity has used it to make fantastic discoveries and huge progress. But in the world of logic, we have created a circular argument. We have tried to prove the logical soundness of inductive thinking using a conclusion based on inductive thinking. Such a proof technique fails realistically. Thinkers and people who study reasoning have dissected this issue in depth, trying to build a rationally sound argument on the truth value of induction. Such an argument might exist, or might not, or some think they might have found one, and yet, more importantly, the topic focuses on the factual value in the official logic sense. The presence or lack of an official evidence about the truth value of inductive reasoning does not undermine induction's effectiveness. Your family pet doesn't mind. It's just glad that you determined what food it likes. Faulty induction. The world shows regularity, and through inductive reasoning, we informally and formally tease out findings and conclusions that, effort to, but with good useful success, capture that consistency. But we can be deceived. We can, and do, reach inaccurate conclusions. Stereotyping represents a major type of faulty induction. Let's say we see several circumstances in which young males are caught when they are speeding. We then notice future such instances. Preferentially, i.e., the first few instances activate a tentative hypothesis, and that makes us more aware of examples that fit the hypothesis. Soon, we begin believing that all young male drivers speed. Though we have likely overreached. In reaching our conclusion, we didn't have any commonly gathered, statistically legitimate demographics of whether all young male chauffeurs speed, or perhaps if significant percentages of them do. Rather, we used selectively collected anecdotal information, making our conclusion too sweeping contrasted with our basis for making it. Connection without casualty also results in some faulty induction. Let's say we do have good demographic info and impartial sample information. Those data show that A and B occurred together at a statistically essential level. So A might be asthma in young children, and B may be lung cancer in a parent or caretaker. We conclude a genetic linkage may be present. Still, we really missed factor C, whether or not the parent smokes. A more thorough look at the data exposes that factor C is the reason for A and B, and that when we control the analysis for such typical causative elements, smoking, air contamination, workplace asbestos, brought home via clothes, and so on, that we cannot statistically show that A and B are linked to one another. In formal research studies, such as on health impacts, researchers have available and do utilize sophisticated techniques to weed out such false casualty. But in our everyday sound judgment, we may not do so as easily. We might conclude certain foods or certain activities cause illness or pain, but at the same time, we fail to notice that we eat those foods or do those activities in certain places. The places could be the cause, or additionally, we could blame the areas when the foods or activity could be the cause. While innovation has not been an unblemished development, most of us would concur it has brought much improvement. The simpler past, while potentially classic, in reality entailed many pain and risks, diseases that couldn't be cured, sanitation that was substandard, less than reputable food products, partially adequate shelter, tough labor, the risk of fire, minimal facilities, slow transportation, slow communication, etc. Technology has eliminated or reduced those miseries and created other problems. Innovation, therefore, has introduced, on balance, a better period. However, where did our innovation come from? I would say that, at a most foundational level, our innovation rests on humanity's capability for inductive reasoning. We have technology as the human mind can see patterns and extrapolate from those patterns to understand the world, and from that understanding, produce technology. Look at other different species in the animal kingdom. Some can master easy learning techniques, meaning hamsters can be taught to push a lever to get food. A few of them can master a bit more intricacy, meaning a few primate individuals can discover symbols and manipulate the symbols to attain rewards. Many species, for instance wolves and lions, have been developing exquisite hunting abilities. So yes, other animal species can take experience, recognize those habits that work, and extrapolate forward to use those habits to attain success in the future. We can consider this as being a level of inductive reasoning. However, the abilities of other species for inductive reasoning rank as unimportant contrasted with humanity. Even in ancient times, mankind created fire, heated metals, domesticated animals, raised crops, charted universal and celestial movements, crafted some kind of vehicle, erected great structures, and on, all of which, at the fundamental level, included inductive reasoning. To do these things, humanity gathered experiences, recognized patterns, tested approaches, and reached conclusions about what worked and what didn't. And that constitutes inductive reasoning. As we are in the modern day age, we find humanity implicitly understood and obviously continues to understand that patterns exist. Knowing the advantages of finding patterns and comprehending the limitations of our inherent senses that we have developed over time and continue to develop all of the time, there are methods and instruments to collect information beyond the abilities of our raw senses. At first, mankind crafted telescopes, better and more accurate clocks, light prisms, weight balances, thermometers, electric measurement devices, and chemistry equipment. We are now a number of generations further, and we use satellites, particle accelerators, DNA sequencers, electron microscopes, health diagnostic devices of all types, and chemical analysis equipment of all variations, to list just a few. With those instruments, mankind collected and continues to gather at outstanding rates information about the world become more widespread. And we have taken and continue to take that info to extrapolate the patterns and laws and regularities in the world. And from those, we expand on technology. Take the car, for example. Just the seats involve lots of inductive conclusions. The seats include polymers, and chemists, over the centuries, have collected many data points and performed substantial experiments to extrapolate the practical and science guidelines required for effective and economic production of the polymers. The polymers are woven into material, and mechanists and innovators needed to generalize from trial and error and knowledge of mechanical devices and the principles of statics and dynamics to conclude what equipment designs would successfully and financially weave fabric. That would be just the seats. As we have mentioned, inductive thinking doesn't by official logic produce conclusions that are guaranteed to be true. We highlighted that with the laws developed by Isaac Newton, Einstein's relativity corrected limitations in the applicability of Newtonian gravity and mechanics. However, that the inductive reasoning of Newton proved less than ideal did not reduce the grandeur or usefulness of his reasoning within the scope of where his laws did and still by and large do apply. Good inductive thinking stands as a hallmark of mankind's intellectual prowess, and though it cannot ensure truth, inductive reasoning can do something most would think is equally valuable or better, and it can enable developments and understanding. Chapter 3: Moral Character. At the heart of one major approach to principles, a technique counting among its supporters Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas, is the conviction that principles is fundamentally associated with what kind of persons we are. Tons of Plato's discussions, for instance, fixate on what kind of persons we ought to be and begin with examinations of particular virtues. What is the nature of justice? Republic. What is the nature of piety? Euthro. What is the nature of temperance? Charmides. What is the nature of courage? Laches. On the assumption that what sort of person one is made up by one's character, the link between ethical character and virtue is clear. We can think of one's ethical character as mainly a function of whether she has or lacks various ethical virtues and vices. The virtues and vices that comprise an individual's moral character are usually comprehended as dispositions to behave in certain ways in certain sorts of scenarios. For instance, an honest person is disposed to telling the truth when asked. Those personalities are normally understood as relatively stable and long-lasting. Further, they're also normally understood to be robust, that is, constant right across a wide spectrum of conditions. We are unlikely, for example, to think that an individual who tells the truth to her good friends but consistently lies to her parents and teachers has the virtue of honesty. Moral character, like most concerns in ethical psychology, stands at the crossway of concerns in both normative ethics and empirical psychology. That suggests that there are convincingly two general approaches one could take when illuminating the nature of moral character. One could approach ethical character mainly by focusing on standards set by normative principles. Whether people can or do measure up to these requirements is irrelevant. Additionally, one could approach moral character under the guideline that normative ethics should be constrained by psychology. On this second approach, it's not that the normative/descriptive distinction vanishes. Instead, it is just that a concept of moral character should be appropriately constrained by what social psychology tells us moral representatives are in simple fact like. Furthermore, specifically since virtue approaches make character and its elements central to moral theorizing, it seems proper that such approaches take the psychological data on character and its parts seriously. This desire for an emotionally sensitive ethics partly clarifies the current renewal of virtue principles, but it also leads to numerous challenges to the idea that agents have robust moral characters. Number 1. Ethical character, ethics, and virtue theory. Etymologically, the term character comes from the ancient Greek term character, which at first described the mark pleased on a coin. The term character later came to refer more usually to any distinctive feature by which just one thing is distinguished from others. Along this general line, in modern use, character typically describes a set of qualities or attributes that can be used to differentiate between individuals. It is used this way, for instance, typically in literature. In philosophy, however, the term character is normally used to refer to the particularly ethical dimension of an individual. This is an example. Aristotle usually used the term ethic for character, which is etymologically linked to ethics and morality, through the Latin equivalent mores. Aristotle's discussion of ethical character and virtue in particular is the most prominent treatment of such concerns. For this reason, his discussion will be used as a start point. The Greek word used by Aristotle and most frequently translated as virtue is arete, which is maybe better translated as goodness or quality. In general, an excellence is a quality that makes an individual a really good member of its kind. This is an example. It is a quality of an axe if it is able to cut wood. An excellence, because of this, is a residential or commercial property whereby its holder runs well or fulfills its function. Along these exact same lines, it is useful to think of qualities as defining features of someone's character. Aristotle, for instance, at times mentions a great moral character as human excellence, or an excellence of soul. Nicomachean Ethics 1:13. The idea here is the same as with the axe. Having a very good ethical character helps its holder operate well, and live up to her potential, thereby satisfying her nature. In Nicomachean Ethics Book 2, Aristotle identifies two types of qualities or virtues: qualities of intellect and excellences of character. However, as we shall see below, he doesn't think these two are totally separable. The excellences of thought include epistemic or intellectual virtues, like technical expertise, accomplishment, and practical knowledge. The last of these, practical knowledge, is especially crucial and will be talked about in greater detail below just because of its relationship with the qualities of character. Given their connection with the intelligence, it is not surprising that he thought that these qualities are fostered through instruction and teaching. Aristotle's phrase for the excellences of character is ethike arete, literally virtue of character, and is sometimes translated as moral virtue. As talked about in greater detail right below, the excellences of character are personalities to act and feel in certain ways. Aristotle notoriously thought a moral personality was virtuous when it was in correct proportion, which he referred to as a mean between two extremes. Quality of character. Then, in a disposition issuing in decisions, depending upon intermediacy of the kind relative to us, this being determined by rational prescription and in the way in which the smart person would decide on it, and in its intermediacy between two bad states, one including excess, the other including deficiency, and also since one set of bad states is deficient, the other excessive in relation to what's required both in affections and actions, while quality both finds and chooses the intermediate. Nicomachean Principles 2:7. For example, the courageous person is someone who is gotten rid of to feel neither more nor less fear than the situation requires. Additionally, insofar as the qualities of character include a person's feelings, and not just her actions, there is a difference between acting virtuously and doing a virtuous action. Simply doing the right action isn't enough to have the moral excellences. One must also be the right sort of individual or have the right sort of character. The topic of ethical character belongs to virtue concept more usually, which is the philosophical assessment of notions connected to the virtues. Roger Crisp identifies virtue principles and virtue theory as follows. Virtue theory is the area of query worried about the virtues in general. Virtue principles is narrower and prescriptive and consists mostly in the advocacy of the virtues. Crisp, 1998, 5. Virtue principles is a subspecies of virtue concept insofar as the former attempts to base ethics on assessment of virtue. A. Character and the three significant approaches to ethics. It is commonplace to distinguish three significant approaches to normative ethics: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. At the heart of consequentialist theories is the idea that the real moral action is the one that produces the best repercussions. According to deontological theories, morality is primarily a function of tasks or responsibilities, regardless of the repercussions of acting in accordance with those responsibilities. Both of these sets of theories are commonly described as ethics of rules. On the other hand, virtue theories give primacy of importance not to rules, but to particular routines of character, like the virtue of courage or the vice of greed. This description of these three approaches is a huge oversimplification. An example could be this: the moral writings of Immanuel Kant are often taken to be the embodiment of deontology, but his lectures on ethics and the second part of the metaphysics of morals focus largely on virtue. However, Even this brief discussion highlights how ethical character plays an especially main role in virtue ethics, even if it can also play a similar role in other approaches to normative principles. Most of the age-old philosophers were virtue theorists of some sort or other. Virtue ethics was often criticized during the contemporary period, but has experienced a revival in recent years. This current resurgence in virtue ethics and virtue theory, more normally, has many sources. Two of the most notable are G.E.M. Anscombe's Modern Moral Philosophy from 1958 and John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, 1971. In her post, Anscombe criticizes deontological and consequentialist approaches to ethics for wrongly concentrating on legalistic concepts of obligations and guidelines. She suggests that ethics would benefit from a sufficient philosophy of psychology. According to Anscombe, only a return to a virtue method of principles and the notions of human growing and well-being will be able to provide for the future thriving of principles. Less directly influential is Rawls. Even though the main aim of A Theory of Justice is not virtue principles, Rawls' conversation of the good citizen manages a crucial place to virtue and ethical character in Part 3. The representative member of a well-ordered society will find that he wants others to have the fundamental virtues, and in particular a sense of justice. Rawls, 1971, 436. B. Moral versus non-moral character. Persons have all types of characteristics: physical, mental, social traits. Not all of these traits are specifically moral in nature, though they can affect someone's ethical character. Psychologist Lawrence Pervin specifies a characteristic as a personality to behave expressing itself in consistent patterns of functioning across a series of circumstances. Pervin, 1994, 108. However, even amongst such qualities, some don't appear ethically appropriate. For instance, Holly's disposition to drink coffee rather than tea, or her personality to exercise by jogging rather than doing yoga, will not be morally appropriate most of the times. We thus need a way to distinguish those qualities that are morally appropriate from those that are not, specifically because philosophers and psychologists tend to use the term character quality in somewhat different ways. Yet the distinctions are vital. Theorists normally believe that ethical characteristics, in contrast to other character or mental traits, have an irreducibly evaluative measurement. That is, they involve a normative judgment. The evaluative dimension is directly associated with the idea that the agent is morally accountable for having the characteristic itself or for the outcome of that quality. Thus, a particularly ethical character trait is a character quality for which the agent is ethically accountable. C. Moral responsibility. According to a prevalent method to moral responsibility, to be morally accountable is to be deserving of the reactive mindsets. According to Peter Strawson, whose work on moral responsibility has had large impact, the reactive attitudes are essentially natural human reactions to the good or ill will or indifference of others to us, as displayed in their attitudes and actions. P. Strawson, 1997, 127. These reactive mindsets can be either positive, as in cases of ethical appreciation, gratitude, respect, love, or negative, as in cases of ethical blame, animosity, and indignation. To put it simply, an individual is morally responsible for carrying out some action X only if that person is the apt recipient of praise, or thankfulness, and so on, or blame, or bitterness, etc. On such an account, an individual could be responsible for some action even if no other person in simple fact actually held her accountable. An individual could be deserving of animosity, for example, for carrying out some action even if no one does, in fact, resent her for carrying out that action. Most work on moral responsibility has concentrated on an agent's responsibility for her actions. Such an account of moral responsibility, however, can be extended past actions to include character qualities as well. Consider the case of Chester. Chester has a really strong desire to molest kids. If he thought he could get away with it, he would kidnap and molest the kids playing on the playground near his house. But Chester is very scared of getting caught since there's a police headquarters across the street from the playground. As a consequence of his fear, Chester never ever does in simple fact molest any kids, and thus isn't deserving of blame or punishment for his conduct in this regard. Regardless of this simple fact, there is still something morally wrong with Chester. He's deserving of blame for being the sort of person that wants to molest children and would if he could get away with it. Finally, there are two related sets of questions that may be inquired about responsibility. The first set of questions is about the general conditions that must be met in order for an agent to be ethically responsible. Such questions include: what sort of power over someone's actions is needed for an agent to be ethically responsible? What is the epistemic condition that must be met in order for an agent to be ethically responsible? Must an action flow from a representative's ethical character for her to be accountable for it? The second sort of question attempts to figure out what prospects go through the conditions for ethical responsibility. In other words, whether a certain individual satisfies these conditions. In what follows, it will be assumed that only persons are morally responsible representatives. Nonetheless, it doesn't follow from the fact that an individual is an ethically accountable representative that she's morally accountable for all her actions and characteristics. 2. A conventional view of moral character. The former section helped to separate ethical versus non-moral character qualities by means of their relationship with ethical responsibility. In essence, ethical character traits are those for which the possessor is the appropriate recipient of the reactive attitudes. Little was said, though, about the exact nature of a moral characteristic. The present section checks out the nature of the most common comprehension of ethical character qualities, which I'm going to call the conventional view of moral character, or standard view for short. Different theories within the traditional view will obviously submit the specifics in varied ways, so it will be helpful to think of the conventional view as a family of comparable and related views instead of a totally developed and determinate view itself. As pointed out earlier, the real moral character qualities that constitute somebody's moral character are usually understood as behavior and affective dispositions. For this reason, it will be helpful to look at personalities in general before turning towards particularly ethical dispositions. That is the topic of the first subsection right below. The second subsection takes a look at virtues and vices as specific types of personalities. The third subsection discusses the three central claims of the traditional view of ethical character. A. Dispositions in general. Personalities are specific kinds of properties or attributes that objects can have. Examples of dispositions include the solubility of a sugar cube in water, the fragility of porcelain, the elasticity of an elastic band, and the magnetism of a lodestone. Dispositional properties are usually contrasted with non-dispositional or categorical properties. Offering a totally adequate account of this difference is challenging, though the fundamental idea is relatively easy to understand. For a discussion of these issues, compare the solubility of a sugar cube in water with its volume. The sugar cube's solubility means that it would dissolve if put in water. The sugar cube need not actually be put in water to be soluble. One simply sees that it is soluble when it is put in water. In contrast, one need refrain from doing anything to the sugar cube to see that it has the categorical property of volume. For the sugar cube always manifests this property in a way that it doesn't always manifest solubility in water. For dispositional properties, there's a difference between a thing having such a property and manifesting its personality. This exact same point will hold true of the virtues talked about beneath. This contrast suggests that dispositional properties fundamentally include conditionality in a way that categorical properties do not. What items are soluble in water at standard temperature, level, and pressure? Just those that would dissolve if positioned in water at standard temperature, level, and pressure. There are a number of esoteric questions about dispositions. Is the conditionality involved in dispositions to be comprehended counterfactually or some other way? Are colors dispositional or categorical properties? Can dispositional properties be decreased to categorical properties or vice versa? Such questions, though, need not worry us here. Instead, it is sufficient to bear in mind that a thing's dispositional properties are usually just as crucial to us as their non-dispositional properties. There would be substantially fewer college students, for instance, with avidity for beer, were it not disposed to trigger intoxication in the ones that drink it. Dispositions can help explain not only why past events happened, but also supply the premises for future events. Certain kinds of items are dispositional in nature. Thermostats, for example. While individuals aren't inherently dispositional in this way, they can and do have numerous personalities. Individuals have some personalities in virtue of their physical bodies, such as solubility in certain solvents, and other personalities in virtue of their psychological lives, such as a disposition to play the piano when one is present, or to give to Oxfam if asked. In fact, Gilbert Ryle has notoriously suggested that the mind, instead of being another compound in addition to the body, is just a set of personalities for the body to behave in certain ways. It is on this basis that Ryle says that substance dualism is a classification mistake. Whether one accepts Ryle's claim, persons have behavior and affective personalities that impact our moral judgments of those individuals. It's to these ethical character qualities that we now turn. B. Virtues and vices as dispositions. Moral character characteristics are those dispositions of character for which it is appropriate to hold representatives ethically responsible. A quality for which the agent is deserving of a positive reactive attitude, like appreciation or gratitude, is a virtue, and a vice is a quality for which the agent is deserving of an unfavorable reactive attitude, such as animosity or blame. Moral character traits are reasonably stable, set and trusted dispositions of action, an effect that ought to be reasonably notified. The subsequent subsections will further illuminate these numerous aspects of ethical character qualities. 1. Relatively stable, set, and trusted. Ethical character qualities are fairly steady and reliable personalities, and thus should be reasonably good predictors over time of an agent's conduct if that agent is in a trait-relevant situation. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that such traits should be exceptionless. For instance, a single case of dishonesty need not mean that an individual lacks a typically truthful character. Thus, the personalities should be understood as involving a certain level of probability. Additionally, while such traits are flexible, people can change their ethical character gradually. Such changes are typically not instant, taking both time and effort. 2. Personalities of action and effect. Ethical character qualities aren't just dispositions to participate in certain external habits. They can also be dispositions to have certain feelings or love. For example, justice is the personality to treat others as they are worthy of to be dealt with, while courageousness is the personality to feel the appropriate amount of fear required by a situation. Additionally, as mentioned above with regard to dispositions in general, a person can have a specific ethical character quality and not currently appear trait-relevant behavior or effect. A person might be generous in her providing to charity, even if she isn't engaged currently in any charitable action. 3. Rationally informed. In order for an ethical character trait to be a virtue, it must not only be in accord with the pertinent moral standards, but the personality must also be informed by correct reasoning about the matter at hand. This is so because the virtues are excellences of character insofar as they are the best exercise of reason. In his discussion of the virtues, for example, Aristotle says that all of the excellences of character must be notified by practical wisdom, phronesis, itself a personality to make morally critical choices in useful matters. This suggests a link between intellectual virtues and virtues of character. C. 3 central features. With the above conversation of the nature of ethical character characteristics in mind, the traditional view can now be summarized as consisting mainly of 3 claims about ethical character: the toughness claim, the stability claim, and the integrity claim. The first 2 are claims about the nature of moral character characteristics, while the third is a claim about the relationship among characteristics within a particular person. 1. Toughness claim. According to the first main claim of the conventional view, an individual with a certain ethical character quality will show trait-relevant behavior across a broad spectrum of trait-relevant situations. Such characteristics are said to be robust qualities. For instance, the robustness claim suggests that an honest person will tend to tell the truth in a wide range of honesty-related circumstances. Honesty toward good friends, relatives, coworkers, students, etc. Given that ethical character traits need not be exceptionless, a single counter instance doesn't rule out an individual's possession of a specific trait and does not contradict the effectiveness claim. 2. Stability claim. According to the stability claim, ethical character traits are fairly stable with time. The stability claim doesn't preclude the possibility of an individual changing his ethical character with time. Rather, it holds that such changes require time. A soldier who has courageously proven himself in battle situations throughout many years won't cease to be brave overnight. If the soldier does act non-courageously in a particular fight, the stability claim suggests that we should still think of the soldier as possessing the virtue of courage unless the soldier behaves non-courageously for a considerable amount of time. 3. Integrity claim. According to the integrity claim, there is a probabilistic connection between having one virtue and having other virtues. An example could be this: an individual who is temperate with regard to the enjoyments originated from food, the virtue of abstinence, is likely to also be temperate with regard to the enjoyments stemmed from sexual intercourse, the virtue of chastity. Likewise, an individual with a particular vice is likely to possess other vices. Here, the stability claim suggests that a person who is disposed to lie for financial gain will likely also be gotten rid of to cheat for financial gain. The traditional view therefore expects a fairly high level of intertrait consistency. This is the most controversial and maybe counterintuitive of the three claims of the standard view. Examples such as the bold and self-managed bomber seem counterexamples to the integrity claim insofar as such an individual appears to possess some virtues, such as bravery, but lacks others, such as justice. Nonetheless, the stability claim has a significant pedigree among virtue theorists. Aristotle held that the multiplicity of virtues are all related by useful wisdom. It is clear it isn't possible to have quality in the main sense without practical knowledge, nor to be smart without excellence of character. As we consider the role that phronesius plays, the evaluative factors to consider, associated with the virtues that are so interdependent that any individual having one virtue will have all of them. Plato likewise held that different virtues are all related by justice. Just recently, Raymond de Vetter described the unity of the virtues thesis like the following. If you have one virtue, you have them all. Virtues cannot be separated. A person not having the virtue of temperance also lacks the virtues of justice, love, etc. Initially, this thesis looks counterproductive, but once the central role of practical knowledge in every moral virtue is understood, the unity of virtues emerges as unavoidable. Socrates took the unity amongst the virtues even further, arguing not only that the virtues are unified in this way, but that there is in simple fact ultimately only one virtue, knowledge. The obvious variety of virtues is in reality just different expressions of this one virtue. Protagoras, 330e through 333d. 3. Obstacles to moral character. As indicated above, versions of the traditional view of moral character laid out in the prior area have long been accepted within the virtue principles custom. Other moral customs, such as utilitarianism and deontology, have been less likely to stress the significance of ethical character, though there are exceptions. For instance, Julia Chauffeur's Uneasy Virtue from 2001 provides a consequentialist account of virtue. Similarly, as discussed above, some of Kant's moral works focus mostly on virtue. In spite of these exceptions, it is not unexpected that many advocates of these other moral traditions have critiqued the traditional comprehension of ethical character and its relation to virtue. More recently, however, the conventional comprehension of ethical character described above has been criticized from other directions. One major source of criticism is motivated by the idea that normative ethics ought to be constrained by the best currently readily available psychological data. According to this view, theories of ethical character ought to be constrained, and certain relates to by what social and cognitive psychology tells us moral agents are actually like. And recent empirical work suggests that agents lack the sort of robust moral character at the heart of the conventional view. Other current difficulties occur from the fact that the preconditions for ethical character can't be met, either because they're undermined by moral luck or because it is unrealistic for a representative to be ethically accountable for anything, in which case ethical character collapses. This area briefly thinks about these current difficulties. A. Situationism. Recently, some thinkers and social scientists have begun to question the really presuppositions that robust theories of ethical character and ethical character traits are based upon. The following quotation by John Doris records this concern. I regard this renaissance of virtue with concern. Like many others, I find the lore of virtue deeply engaging, yet I cannot help seeing that much of this lore rests on psychological theory that's some 2,500 years of age. A concept is not bad just as it is old, but in this case, developments of more current vintage suggest that the old ideas are in trouble. Particularly, modern experimental psychology has found that situation has surprisingly more to do with how people behave than standard pictures of character and virtue enable. Doris, 2002, IX. Simply put, the traditional view of moral character is empirically inadequate. See also Michel from 1968. This criticism of the conventional view started with attributionism, a branch of psychology that seeks to differentiate what's appropriately attributable to an individual's character from what's appropriately attributable to outside features. Much of attribution concept associates a significantly higher proportion of the causal basis of behavior to external factors and less to ethical character than traditionally thought. According to such theorists, most people overstate the role of dispositional aspects like ethical character in clarifying an individual's behavior, and ignore the role the circumstance plays in explaining an agent's conduct. Gilbert Harman expresses this idea as follows. In trying to define and clarify a distinct action, ordinary thinking tends to assume a corresponding distinctive characteristic of the agent and tends to ignore the appropriate details of the representative's perceived situation. Common attributions of characteristics to people are often deeply misdirected, and it might even be the case that there are no ordinary qualities of the sort of people think there are. Harman, 1999, 315F. Philosophers like Doris and Harman have used this work in the social sciences to develop an alternative approach to moral character, frequently known as situationism. Like the conventional view, situationism can be comprehended as consisted of three central claims. Non-robustness claim. Moral character's traits aren't robust. That is, they are not consistent right across a wide spectrum of trait-relevant circumstances. Whatever ethical character traits a person has are situation-specific. Consistency claim. While a person's ethical characteristics are reasonably stable in time, this should be comprehended as consistency of situation-specific traits, instead of robust qualities. Fragmentation claim. An individual's moral characteristics do not have the evaluative stability suggested by the integrity claim. There might be substantial disunity in a person's moral character amongst her situation-specific characteristics. Therefore, situationism rejects the first and third claims of the traditional view and embraces only a customized variation of the second claim. According to situationists, the empirical proof favors their view of moral character over the conventional view. To point out just one early example, Hugh Hartshorne and M.A. May's study of the trait of sincerity amongst school kids found no cross-situational correlation. A kid may be consistently sincere with his friends, but not with his parents or instructors. From this and other studies, Hartshorne and May conclude that character traits aren't robust, but rather particular functions of life situations. Hartshorne and May, 1928, 379 F. Other research studies farther bring into question the integrity claim of the standard view. B. Moral luck. A second challenge to the conventional view can be found in the idea of moral luck. While there are some varieties of moral luck, the underlying idea is that ethical luck happens when the real moral judgment of a representative depends on aspects beyond the agent's control. There are a number of ways that ethical luck can encourage criticisms of ethical character. A species of moral luck that's especially pertinent to situationism is circumstantial or situational luck, which is the luck associated with the sort of problems and circumstances one deals with. Nagel, 1993-60. If all of a representative's ethical characteristics are situation-specific rather than robust, what traits an agent manifests will depend on the situation that she finds herself in. However, what circumstances an agent finds herself in is usually past her control and hence a matter of situational luck. According to one experiment conducted by Eisen and Levine, experimenters searched for helping conduct in unaware subjects after they left a public phone booth. Whether the people helped a person in need was found considerably influenced by whether or not one had just found a dime in the phone booth. If our having certain qualities is itself a matter of luck, this would appear to undermine an individual's moral responsibility for an individual's ethical character, and therefore the idea of moral character entirely. As Owen Flanagan and Amelie Oxenberg-Rorty write, the morality and meaning of an individual's life will depend on luck in an individual's upbringing, the values she's taught, the self-controlling and self-constructing capacities her social environment allows and motivates her to develop, the moral obstacles she faces or avoid. If all her character, not just temperamental qualities and personalities, but also the reflexive capabilities for self-discipline and self-construction are matters of luck, then the extremely ideas of character and agency are in threat of evaporation. Flanagan and Rorty, 1990, 5. C. Impossibility of being responsible for one's character. Connected to the problem presented by moral luck is the third current challenge to the standard view, particularly the idea that moral responsibility is unrealistic. Indeed, this alternative could be understood as taking the issue that moral luck proposes to its rational conclusion. It was suggested above that what makes a character quality a particularly moral characteristic, and therefore a constituent of a person's ethical character, is an evaluative measurement of that quality. A moral characteristic is a character quality for which the representative is ethically accountable. To put it simply, the apt recipient of the reactive mindsets. If moral responsibility is impossible, though, then agents cannot be held responsible for their character qualities or for the behaviors that they do as a result of those character traits. Why might one think that ethical responsibility and hence moral character is impossible? Galen Strawson, from 1994, sums up the argument which he calls the standard argument in this way. In order to be morally accountable, a representative would need to be a reason for itself, or causa sui. Nothing can be causa sui. Thus, no agent can be morally accountable. The idea behind the standard argument can be elaborated as follows. In order for a representative, Allison, to be responsible for some action of hers, that action must be a result of the kind of person that Allison is. We might say, for example, that Allison is blameworthy for eating way too much chocolate at time t because she's a gluttonous person. But in order for Allison to be responsible for being a gluttonous individual at t, she would need to be accountable at some other time, t1, for being the sort of person that would later become a gluttonous person. But in order for Allison to be responsible for being the kind of person that would later become a gluttonous person, she would have to be responsible at some earlier time, T2, for being the sort of person that would later end up being the kind of person that would later become a gluttonous person. According to Strawson, this line of thinking begins in unlimited regress. True self-determination is unrealistic as it requires the completion of a boundless series of choices of principles of choice. A comparable argument has also just recently been promoted by Bruce Waller. According to Waller, nobody is ethically accountable for her character or deliberative powers, or for the results that flow from them. Given the simple fact that she was formed to have such attributes by environmental or evolutionary requires far past her control. She deserves no blame, nor appreciation. Of course, if moral responsibility is impossible, then all moral theories that include responsibility are wrong, not just the standard view of ethical character. So the argument for the impossibility of ethical responsibility isn't just a challenge for the standard view, but for all views. And there's maybe reason to think that character-based approaches are better able to deal with this issue than our choice-based theories. D. Reactions. These current obstacles to the traditional view have not gone undetected. Some have tried to customize the traditional view to insulate it from these difficulties, while others have tried to show how these challenges fail to undermine the traditional view at all. This is an example Dana Nelkin, Christian Miller, Gopal Srinivasan, and John Sabini, and Maury Silver from 2005, to name a few, have said that the empirical evidence mentioned by the situationists does not show that people lack robust character qualities. This has been Critical Thinking, Inductive and Deductive Reasoning Explained by Marco Jameson, narrated by J.A. Leidig.